Hi, this is Paul. I did on Friday mornings on the Discord Bridges of Meaning Discord server, the link of which is below. Friday mornings lately from 10 to 12, I've been doing some question and answer with people and just having a wonderful time in the Discord server with the terrific community that's on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. And one of the questions I got today from Eric, who's been on my channel a few times, Eric Hamilton, was, where really is the connection between Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein? Now, beyond Eric being the one who coined the term intellectual dark web, I can understand his question, and I'll make some comments about that later in the video. But a lot of this has to focus on the question of religion and religiosity. Because part of what made Jordan Peterson such an interesting bridge person is because he was sort of ambiguous in this frame. He was religious enough to raise the ire of the likes of Sam Harris, who wanted to debate him, had 6 substantive conversations with him, and what we perpetually saw was that Sam was so annoyed, as is Rationality Rules and a bunch of other celebrity, or maybe not quite celebrity, atheists out there who are very much annoyed at Jordan Peterson. And they're annoyed by him partly because, unlike me, he wasn't a pastor. He wasn't one of these modernist apologists that usually debate these people. Jordan Peterson kind of came in under the radar, and as Rationality Rules via Destiny noticed, he didn't really cross the line himself, but he took people so close to the line that sort of became this ramp that people followed him up and right across the line into religiosity. And one of the things that I've noticed is that in many ways, sort of the truce that modernity afforded was what Richard Newhouse called the naked public square. You can have your religion, but keep it private, keep it home. And in some ways, a lot of the culture war is fought over this terrain because many in the 80s and the rise of the religious right not only didn't get the memo, but they refused the memo to keep their religiosity at home. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about in this video. And again, I'm going to use one of Eric's recent podcasts to illustrate this. His podcast with Ryan Holiday, who I'd never heard of until hearing this podcast. Now, so we've got Jordan Peterson, we've got John Vervaeke and his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. We have Eric Weinstein. Well, what do they all have in common? Alistair McGrath, in his conversation with Bret Weinstein, Eric's brother, on Unbelievable, at the end of it, Alistair McGrath sort of coyly sits back and says to Bret, it almost sounds like you're wanting to start a new religion. And of course, John Vervaeke has been talking a lot about his religion that isn't a religion. And if you look at the work of Rebel Wisdom, another kind of a central piece in this whole playing field, Rebel Wisdom in some ways really sort of gets right at this, because they're not a church, and they're certainly not advocating church. They're not necessarily church hostile. When David and Ollie visited Sacramento on their California tour, they were wonderfully gracious. And then one of the members of Living Stones asked David something about his belief, and David remarks on this in his conversation with Andrea with the Bangs, how. And if I had thought about this when I was putting the video together, I would have played the clip. But David didn't quite know how to answer that question. Religion, institutional religion, and even more so religiosity, which comes up in Eric's conversation with J.D. Vance, is really sort of stalking this whole business. We need a religion that will do the kinds of things that religion used to do, especially in terms of scaling and mobilizing communities and creating movements that go through time. Because you really cannot understand the rise of the West apart from the rise of Christianity in the West. And contrary to Steven Pinker and many others, the Enlightenment was as much an expression of religious ferment as the Protestant Reformation, but in a different way. And when I listen to some of what Eric talks about, he's really anti-apathy, and he wants people to go out there and have passion and express and pursue and do all of this. And this is very close to, this is what, in fact, religion does best. It motivates people to do wonderful things or to do heinous things. And so we keep hearing how we need a replacement for religion, but it can't be a religion, so all of the necessary actors need not apply, because been there, done that, it's failed. But then Jordan Peterson comes along and people start to wonder, is it really spent? Might there be something there? Jordan's not a member of the church except his own. The replacements are to function in its place. The replacements are to do what it did, but there's something in the original that must be taken out. So that don't confuse me and think I'm religious. I'm not religious. Well, what is this thing that must be excluded? Now, it's very, very difficult to define the word religion. And if you don't believe me, the Supreme Court has been all over this terrain, and they're really scared of it, because religion is about as fudgy a word as you're going to find. But now, what then? What ideas will we turn? One of the things that, so I watched a few of Ryan Holiday's videos in preparation for this, and in some ways, he's asking the same questions as Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson says, well, if you look at a cornfield, you need to know how to move to get through the cornfield. And Ryan Holiday says, and with the stoicism that he's working, well, this is training on how to live. Okay. But it's not religious. Okay. Well, let's listen to some of the podcast.
What do you think the biggest distortions that we're wrestling with in our minds are, where there is a resolution that immediately catapults us to a different metacognitive level of understanding of our environment? In other words,
now,
what is it that you see is most off in people's understanding, where there is a fix and you can say, "What? Now that I see that, I understand why I'm behaving this way, why I don't feel right about my family relations, I'm not comfortable with the media or our political process."
Now, this could very easily be understood as a religious question. When Eric first started the portal, I listened to his first, description of what the portal was going to be, and I thought, what's he talking about? If this were a church context, we might call the portal the sacrament. Because what Eric is looking for are these places in the world where you penetrate the veil and draw closer to, as Steve Martin called in Leap of Faith, the genuine article. And so here Eric, in a sense, asks Ryan Holiday the religious question. And the answer will be, again, quite religious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I get a sense from a lot of my peers that there's this kind of feeling of unrootedness and being untethered. And
we're barking up the tree of the meaning crisis. We're talking about the great masses that suddenly heard Jordan Peterson as a clarion call in the wilderness.
And it's like they're looking for it everywhere. They're looking for peace and meaning in psychedelics and polyamorous relationships and, traveling and, influence.
It's the exact same list that I would have come up with.
Okay. Interesting. And to me, the solution of 90% of the problem.
Wait, don't tell me.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's both fix it in our minds.
Okay.
I won't change mine. You won't change yours.
Okay.
Give me yours.
I love that. Sounds like a couple of boys on the plane. I don't mean that dismissively. I love it because it sounds like a couple of boys on pinky swear, double pinky swear. Let's cut our fingers and mix our blood together. And it's a delightful moment in the podcast.
I think for most people, I think this would be the solution to the elite angst and anxiety, as well as the alt-right anger and fear. It's like, get married, have kids, live within your means, find work that's purposeful and fulfilling to you.
And I hear that answer and I think that's an enormously traditional answer. That's been the answer that has been given in how many churches, in how many mosques, in how many synagogues, in how many lodge meetings, in how many living rooms. Young man, you're doing all this craziness. What you need to do is find a woman and settle down and have some kids. Well, the women tend to are already often a little bit more motivated, and as a man, I often think about that and think, boy, that's got to be inbred, because when women look at men, it's really hard to imagine what they see as attractive in us, because I don't see it. But there you have it. What a really traditional answer.
This just happened. I went to, I think it was Joe Green was opening this treehouse. It was one of these intentional communities. Everybody's talking about we have a loss of spirituality.
Yeah.
We have a need for community like never before. Our lives have to be meaningful.
Yeah.
And then all this stuff about nutrition. I always pick on Tulum because people are always going to Tulum.
Yeah, they are.
I had to look it up. I didn't see. I'm not. Apparently, it's a really great place to go in Mexico, in the Yucatan, and you can see ruins and have good meals. And I'm just a poor pastor of a little church in Sacramento, so never been to Tulum. Although, thanks to Warren Mills, I have been to Australia.
Yes.
Psychedelics, all of these kind of intentional getaways.
Yeah.
And I raised my hand. I said, "How many of you have children?" And like one hand goes up in a very crowded room.
Right.
And I said, "Have you ever considered that what it is that you're looking for is family?"
Yes.
And maybe even belonging to your local mosque, church, or synagogue, whether or not you believe.
Right.
And, I heard that. And he said it before. And he's been quite consistent. And he talks about himself as having, he does, I don't know how often he goes, but he is a member of a synagogue, and he doesn't believe, but this is very mid-20th century mainline-ish, okay? And this has come up before. You see it in Dave Rubin. You see it in Douglas Murray. There's a back to the 50s element in this, it's almost like marriage and children is a sacramental move, because it's a portal to. It's not the thing itself, but it's the path to the thing itself. And it's a path of, as they're going to talk about in a minute, it's a path of renunciation. It's a path of sacrifice. It's a path of love. And when I say it's a path of love, again, part of the corruption of the word love in our culture is that we associate it too exclusively with an emotion, when what love really is, read 1 Corinthians 13, that part of the Bible that even Sam Harris would not turn his nose up to. It's your well-being at my expense, and every woman who brings a child into the world does so at the risk of her own health and potentially her life. But that's the portal.
And I don't think it even occurs to them that this is, they've got a family-sized hole in their souls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a weird thing, Silicon Valley, and it's Silicon Valley, but I mean more like the larger system of sort of media and questions and what. It's like they've kicked out the legs of all the stools, all the legs of the stool. Like families kicked out, showing up at an office is kicked out. Even if you show up at an office, having your own space inside the office is kicked. Like all the things that used to make us feel normal and comfortable and safe and rooted.
And that provide.
Now, Mad Men was a popular TV show. Hey, Mark. Mad Men was a popular TV show. If you read George Marsden's Twilight of the American Enlightenment, George nicely lays out the angsty conversations of the 50s. And again, the 50s are really 1945 to 1965. The angsty conversation of the 50s over the company man and the corporate man and the hollow man. And it's very introduction that, of course, the generation that exemplified that, the generation that will be treated quite a bit in this video, which are the boomers, were the generation before them, the silent generation, the ones who fought in World War II. They were the ones who, after trying to endure all the trauma of war, came back and wanted the routine. And if you got into IBM, you were, you would get a pension managed by a professional at the end of your life, and so on and so forth.
Normal to go to WeWork and bring your stuff to a large community table every day.
Yeah.
You should have a desk with pictures of your kids.
Well, I don't want to say
you
normatively.
Yeah.
But the thing that I'm just fascinated by is the idea isn't occurring to these people.
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
Now, that observation is really important, that the idea isn't occurring to these people. And I would say it isn't occurring to them because in the counterculture, it was dismissed, ridiculed, and vilified. Now, there's a lot of class issues that go through these conversations that Eric is hosting. And Eric very much wants to see himself, I'm not saying he isn't, wants to see himself as sort of this elite defender of the working guy, the working stiff. I'm going to have to do a little bit more background into he and Bret, where they grew up. But there's, in New York culture, there's a lot of that. So I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, very much part of that New York culture. I was born in 1963, so I'm just at the end of the baby boom and just before the Xers. I'm right in that cusp period where actually a lot of these individuals are. If you look at Eric, if you look at Peter Thiel, if you look at Jordan Peterson, age-wise, they're all in that same, John Vervaeke too, all in that same period right there. And at least in the New York metropolitan area, there was definitely a populism in the culture, and you can see that sometimes in Governor Cuomo's talk, in kind of the Italian working class, good.
Once you have a kid in a school and you're worried about how the kid is doing, and other parents have the same concerns about the same teachers,
especially at public school,
and you're having these conversations, you start to think, oh, well, this is what my body is programmed for, is to take this incredible interest in a tiny number of people. Now, I don't mean to say, and I'm positive that you won't mean to say, that every single person needs to go have a child.
Right. It's just most people.
Most people, on average.
Yeah.
Even, and I'm not even...
Now, in my conversation on the Discord server today, we actually had a pretty interesting conversation on traditional sexuality, and I made the comment that one of the things that was achieved in what was Christian views of sexuality and marriage and family, which became, at least for a time in the United States, the dominant ought for individuals was that it afforded, on a mass level, the opportunity to do exactly what they're talking about. In other words, polygamy is a bad idea because very few men get actually to share in this, and women don't share in it either. And very much recommend Bishop Barron's video on whether or not David Brooks had it right in the question of the nuclear family. So it's very interesting listening to Eric and Ryan talk about this in the way that they are. Now they're going to add some footnotes in this, which are themselves interesting, but I'm not going to deal with them here.
Talking about having a great family, like
Yeah.
have a challenged, difficult family
Yeah.
like everybody else.
Yeah, it could be a gay family, it could be a transgender family. It doesn't really matter.
There's the footnote, and
A dysfunctional family,
Yeah.
it could be a family with a lot of pain.
Right. No, you need that. I do think you need that. Also, I think it has all these weird unintended benefits, even just like, oh, it puts you on a schedule because the kids go to wake up at a certain time and go to bed at a certain time. They need a bath at a certain time.
now his assumptions here are right, but here's the thing, that the bedtimes for the kids and the schedule for the kids, these aren't natural, because you can look at babies raised by hippies, you can look at babies raised by negligent parents. In fact, it's the good parent that not only creates the schedule for the child, but then adopts the schedule for themselves on behalf of the child too.
And like they go to a same place most days of the week. You know, like it roots you
Rhythm replaces strength.
in life in a way that when you have unlimited options and unlimited choice, you are paralyzed.
And right there, we see some of the paradoxes of our culture, which has put choice way up at the top of the hierarchy and established it as kind of a good in and of itself. And here we begin to see some of the limits of choice.
I mean, I don't know whether you found this. Your oldest is 3?
3.5, and then I have a 7-month-old. So
Okay.
I'm in deep in the shit.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, this is great.
Yeah.
He's just starting.
Yeah.
By the way, 3 was definitely I heard about the terrible 2s. We had
Yeah.
terrible 3s.
I got some banter here.
They call it three-nager. I don't feel it a lot, but sometime after my son was born, because my career's been successful, I've done interesting things, and I had a kid, and I was like, oh, I could be done. Like I'd done it all. Like, obviously you want to be around, you want to have more, you want to do more, but you're just like, oh, like there was this weird evolutionary sense of having ticked all the boxes. Did you ever?
And now, both of these individuals are exceptional. Okay, they're both living lives, have a degree of economic security, access to wealthy, powerful, influential people. At the upper end of IQ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They've both been immensely privileged in terms of their opportunities and the capacities that they were born with.
Feel that?
Our oldest skipped her last year of high school and went to college.
Okay.
And we had this sense of like, wait a minute, we succeeded?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And I'm not even positive
Yeah.
that I think college is a good idea,
Yeah.
but it was just the sense of like,
You got them from beginning to the plane has the wheels have left the ground.
wheels have left the ground.
Yeah.
And again, to answer Eric's question on the Discord about, where's the intersection on the Venn diagram between Eric and we'll throw in Ryan and Jordan Peterson. This, it's not nostalgic. This appreciation and respect for the kinds of values that were mid-century American, considered Christian, traditional. Not polygamy, but one man, one woman, nuclear family, opportunities.
And that was one of these feelings where you do have that sense that somehow you've contributed. One of the things I find very strange is that children are about the most interesting thing to have, but they're terrible for talking about them, particularly to people who don't have them.
Yeah, it's inevitable. It's ineffable.
There's an inevitable quality. Yeah. And what was I going to try to get at? Something here.
And it also gives you a weird relation to your own body and feelings, in that, like, if you could step back from it, you know it's hard and exhausting and difficult, and somehow your body and mind is telling yourself that it's worth it and amazing. Like, you get a sense that, like, oh, my body is, like, that my wife would like to have another kid. I'm like, you saw what this did to you. Like, it was horrible.
I mean,
like,
let's be honest.
Yeah.
This was a life and death activity. Still is occasionally, but...
Yeah. And you're still not sleeping from the first two.
Right.
You've not gotten any of the stuff you wanted to get back yet. But your mind is able to... It's where... It's like the equivalent... Like, so normally you're flying the plane and you're convinced you're the pilot, and then every once in a while autopilot kicks in and you realize that it's overriding you and you don't have nearly as much of a say in it as you think you have had. That I think kids sort of give you a weird glimpse into how biologically driven you are and your life is.
So I'm very concerned about the idea that a lot of the people that I really love and take seriously don't have a particular concern about the world beyond their own lifespan. And that's very hard to convince them of why they should care.
Now, this is another really interesting point, because this is a point made by C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man. Where does Eric get this idea that people should care about the world beyond their lifespan? If you really sit down and think about that question, humanity should be preserved, C.S. Lewis mentioned in The Abolition of Man. But where do you get that idea? Where's that idea coming from? Upon what can you base that idea?
A lot of these people increasingly have an idea of, I don't really need to have kids, I enjoy my life, but it's very somatic. It's very much about the purpose of life is to be happy. And if there's one thing
Here's another intersection between Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein. The courage to deny happiness as the summum bonum of human life.
Reasonably convinced of the purpose of life is not to be happy.
I think we would be happier if that's what we were bred for or made for. Yeah.
Well, happiness is approximate to guide you to doing certain things that are actually about something related. I mean, it's not orthogonal to happiness, but some kind of fulfillment.
There's a Greek saying where it's like, society is great when old men plant trees.
Trees in whose shade they will never sit.
Yeah. And
I just was trying to make this point to people, and they act as if they've never heard it.
Well,
what is the sign of an unhealthy culture? A healthy culture affords wisdom to people who have not had the lifespan to earn it themselves. That's what a healthy culture is for.
Is it weird? Most people have never heard it. If you look at, it's the exact opposite of how demographics, voting patterns seem to go. The older you get, the more conservative you are, the more selfish you tend to get. It's strange that we are looking at
Did he just equate conservatism with selfishness? That's interesting.
Political system in which the young people are most concerned about, and look, there's obviously, these are nuanced issues, so I'm not meaning, but it's young people who are most concerned with climate change. It's young people who are most concerned with the solvency of sort of various institutions or,
look, we've got a psychotic generation, and I don't know why, because you can't have everybody being a psychopath.
Yeah.
But the boomer generation, there is something bizarrely wrong with these people as an aggregate, not as individuals, but But as an aggregate, their concern for their own children is so diminished from what I would expect.
Yes.
And their concern with their lifestyle is so exaggerated. And again, everything has to be filtered through on average.
Sure.
So
Right.
please, before you attack all the standard disclaimers, what the F?
It's strange. It's very strange. What's the term for it now is dream hoarding.
Wait,
which
I haven't heard this.
Yeah, so it's like who are the NIMBYs? Who are the people who?
And now again, this is a regular theme of what Eric talks about. This comes up again and again, and this is part of his stump speech.
Who are most in favor of legacy admissions to colleges? But you go down the list. It's wealthy people who are primarily concerned with themselves, and in some case, if we're lucky, they're 1 to 2 children. It's not a sense of like when we say our kids. I forget who said it.
Now, what's interesting is if you go, and I actually looked for it and I couldn't find it, but if you look at one of the 2 talks with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and Bret Weinstein, they were making the points about, okay, so you would run into a burning building to save your child. Why would you run into a burning building to save someone else's child? Because evolutionarily, those are 2 different cases. And it's interesting how that observation and this little discussion here are paralleling.
It was very brilliant. I think about it all the time. He said, a generation or 2 ago, if you said like, we're going to build a park for our kids, or we're going to put in a swimming pool for our kids, you meant a community swimming pool in your neighborhood. Now you mean we're putting in a swimming pool in the backyard.
Now, could all of this have something to do with the recession of Christianity in our culture? Because, of course, it was Christianity that tried to make brothers and sisters out of people of different ethnic groups, different backgrounds, different nations. It was that universality of Christianity that now Jews and Gentiles are part of the same tribe. In fact, the sermon that I just made my rough draft from 1 Peter 2, you who were not a people are now a people. You are now a tribe. You are now a herd. And who does that tribe include? Well, it can include anybody. It can include everyone. Now, nationalism functions similarly, but I would argue that nationalism is in some ways downstream of Christianity, because one of the things that Christianity did was, Jesus admonishes his hearers, don't imagine that that you will be saved because you are Abraham's children. God can make children of Abraham out of these stones of the ground, Jesus says. And so what you see in Christianity is this universalizing of that which was tribal and particular in the ancient world before it.
Right.
We're going to put a large fence around so the neighborhood kids don't come in it.
Well, my version of this is, why am I more concerned about your children than you're concerned about your children?
Yeah.
Like, I'm a Gen Xer. My audience is largely millennials. I rag on the millennials to an extent.
Sure.
But honestly, it's this avuncular concern. Like, hey, how do I help you guys figure out why you're feeling blocked with work? Because let me tell you, I believe all standard career paths don't make sense, which is a terrible thing to be growing up with.
Yeah.
Not all of you need to have children, but a lot of you are pretending you don't need to have children, so that you don't feel bad if it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
How do I say something to help you couple and court and realize these dreams? And then when I listen to the boomers, they have this attitude of like, yeah, I just figure everybody will find their bliss and make their own way. And we know we did, and I just think, do you have any idea, for example, how crushing college is as an experience relative to when you went through it?
Me?
Now, before we get into the section that I call Millennial Tears, I want to just pause here and point out that in the 1950s, the conversation that he's just having here would very much have been situated in a church, mainline or evangelical. Where exactly, so now this conversation is not religious. Before it was religious. Before, Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply and fulfill the earth. So what exactly is the religious line, and where is it? And I don't think you'll be able to either define it or live it at high resolution, but religion is the natural behavior in a culture that wants to eat organic, but is skittish about religion, organized religion, if you put that word in front of it. Oh, so you want chaotic religion? Well, a lot of people do, but will your chaotic religion... Now, again, one of the conversations that we had on the Discord server was that one of the differences between, say, Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein is that Jordan Peterson saw the path, the fruitful path to the future to be in the conversion and the conversion of the individual. And if the individual is saved, the institutions will be saved. And in some ways, and it's in that way that Jordan is sort of evangelical, okay? Eric is more mainline-ish here because Eric is focusing on the institutions. And if the institutions are healthy, then the individuals will be okay who live within them and are formed and shaped by them. But there again is this thing out there, the religious, that what we're doing now is we're not talking religion. We're talking, well, what are we talking? Well, we're talking, and we'll put all kinds of other different words on it. But we want to get, 50 years ago, we would have been talking about religious things, and these conversations would have been had in church. And the authority between them would have been, well, God says to do this. Whereas in this case, they're sort of flipping it and saying, well, this is what I have discovered through empirical evidence gathering, and noted that this is the path to life. Now, maybe I'll just continue listening to it through. We'll go through 129 here, but again, this is sort of what they go through is Millennial Tears, and I can completely understand the argument that millennials, the children of the boomers, have had it harder than the boomers. I think that's right. But in the grand scheme of things, over the lifetime of planet Earth, if the boomers had it exceptional, the millennials have had it a little less than that exceptional, but still pretty darn good.
You went through it.
Me?
No.
Oh, yes,
you
totally.
boomers.
Right, because they remember paying $55 for tuition to go to UCLA, and it's now $55,000.
But why does nothing get through?
It's very strange. Well, I remember one of the
Don't you know people?
I saw from you many years ago that I think about often is you looked at like the average age of...
See, and my little comment about don't you know people is because why doesn't this get through? That's built on expectations. Well, what are the cultural expectations about people? Well, it's very Rousseauian. It's very individuals. People are basically good. Well, obviously, if you look at an Augustinian version of people, they're not that good. People are really complex. And it shouldn't be terribly surprising to us that people are selfish and do selfish things. Okay, for the interest of time, I'm going to jump forward, and Eric is talking about a conversation with his grandfather.
Right.
Sure.
So one of his friends says to me, everything's changed so much. There used to be 14 boys who all played in the street where we live, and we've been in that house for decades. Yeah. And I said, well, how many boys play in the street now? He says, none. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, no families can afford this street.
Yeah.
I said, does that strike you that you were able to afford this street when you started, and now you have an idea of course no families can afford? I mean, is there any part of this that lands? None of it.
It's like you should move into a 2-bedroom condo, and then you should have moved to Florida, and then people could have your house. It's not only that it can't afford it.
And again, in all fairness, I grew up in North Jersey in the 60s and 70s, and my graduating class graduated our Christian school in 1981. And one of the things that I noticed just a few years after that is the majority of my classmates would have a pretty difficult time affording the lifestyle that their parents had offered them. And in fact, we just did a little Zoom class reunion, and most of the people that I talked to were living in Hawthorne. Now, Hawthorne is not a bad place to live, but it's not Wyckoff or Midland Park or Franklin Lakes or Pompton Lakes. Okay? So, yeah, I agree with the point, but it isn't just that if grandpa moved out of the house, the kids could play in the street. Part of it is, well, the cities have been making places for kids to play because they don't want them playing in the street. And there's a lot of variables in here, but the main point is that wealth has not been evenly distributed amongst the generations either. There's been an accumulation of wealth.
It's that you're still in the house.
No, yes, but I would say it differently.
But I just mean in California, it's also because boomers aren't selling their houses because they don't want to.
Now Ryan grew up in Sacramento, and actually when I moved here in 97, lived in the church parsonage, which was probably hindsight a bad move, because the house that we paid $240,000 for in 2004 was only worth $95,000 in 97. So there's a lot going on with this.
But they don't want to take the tax hit.
Here's the disconnect for me. Do you understand that you caught a wave? Do you imagine that the rest of us just aren't as smart as you? And then nobody's hardworking? Because that's one of the memes. It's like, well...
One of the things that comes up again and again is our bias towards smarts. Smart is sort of the... this is what we value in other people.
And I believe that it's exactly the reverse, that the millennials watched the Xers. This is a friend of mine says, he said, we watched you give everything to try to make these careers work and fail, and so we're not going to fall for that, so we're going to Tulum.
Interesting. Sure. Yeah. Or it's like if retirement's a lie and it's not going to happen,
right,
you should go to Tulum now.
You should go to Tulum and front load your life because, quite frankly, we don't have a plan. There's no retirement.
Now this gets into the decadence. This gets into the no longer belief in progress. This gets into, and I would argue this also gets into secularity because, Eric complained that, and Ryan agreed with him, that people should be biased towards future generations that they won't know. Okay. What's the imaginary of that? Well, it's eschatological. That's the theology of that. Now, when you stripped out the theology of eschatology, that's a lot of minister talk. When you stripped out the hope for heaven, what got stripped out with it? What baby is out there kicking on the lawn?
Plan.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Yeah, there's also, I think, let's say you're a millennial, it's like, I remember my freshman year of high school, I watched 9/11 live on television. Then I watched the war in Iraq. Then I watched the financial crisis.
You watched them all on television, my friend. And a lot of people around the world in various times that would have much rather watched it on television.
I was lucky in that I dropped out of college. I didn't take...
Well, we had it rough. We didn't even have a television to watch it on.
Any debt. I caught some waves that other millennials didn't get to catch.
Right.
But that's a dark 10-year period right there.
Really? Is it really that dark? Cuban Missile Crisis, assassinations, Vietnam, bombings in the 70s. I'll tell you, when I watched The Joker and I looked at those city streets, I thought, I'm looking at my childhood. And sure enough, he filmed it in Newark, and Newark hasn't been all prettified like New York City has. When I went back to Patterson after my father's death, and we had a memorial service for him in 2013, and I'd been back to New York City in 2006, and of course I was just sort of shocked. I'd been out of the country for a number of years between there, and I hadn't been back to New York in a long time. I was just like, where'd all the white, young, pretty people come from? I remember New York City from the 70s and A-Beam and the garbage strike, and that was the New York City from the Joker movie. So yeah, every generation has its things. But the point he's about to make now, I think, is really the more important point.
Right there, like of shit happening and being lied to, and
the lying to. I mean, when you look at what really, not just one thing, of course, but what really destroyed this world of Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, that they just finished sort of promoting: have a kid, settle down, have a routine, have a job you go to every day, have an office, do all this regular stuff. Now again, these two individuals, they're much more jet setters. I have an office. You see me in it all the time. What really destroyed that? We were lied to. And this is where I think Ryan really makes some incredibly important points.
You watched, I think the antagonism between millennials and boomers is not just the straight generational conflict, but it's almost like the boomer conflict between their parents. It's like, sure, there are problems, but like there was a heroism to the greatest generation and a sacrifice there. It's like
the boomers respected something about their parents, even though they rebelled.
We just watched like sort of rank moral hypocrisy and selfishness from the boomer generation without much.
The boomer generation wasn't credible. They were the children of affluence. They were the children of privilege. They were the children, again, these are vast generalizations,
in the way of redeeming qualities. Do you know what I mean?
Well, see, I don't think let me just give my spin on this. There's nothing magical about the generations. The key question is, what was your developmental environment and your economic environment growing up?
Yeah.
So I thought I just had a problem with authority. Turned out when I started working for somebody younger than myself as an Xer, somehow the Xers don't figure into the millennial story, which is we Xers think it's hysterically funny. I found that I was easily able to take direction from somebody like Peter Thiel, not because I had a hierarchy or authority issue, but because really the problem was silence, and boomers have beliefs that I don't share.
Sure.
This is interesting. He's noticing the line between.
They just don't understand. What they do makes no sense to me. None. I cannot process it.
They lived in a different world.
And it's not like I haven't studied it or tried to understand it. It's just certain things that are obvious realities to me. It's like speaking in a high frequency that their ears can't hear.
Yeah.
The division to me is you had silence and boomers, and then there's a line, and then Xers, millennial, Gen Z are all saying, well, we're not part of whatever story is going on above that line.
And maybe to tie back to the art discussion.
So we're not part of that story, okay? And I think now Ryan's going to make a really.
I think one of the big problems is that we don't have any story whatsoever. There's no mediums, music.
Well, we're not part of whatever story is going on above that line.
There's no meta-narrative. We've heard this before. It's postmodernity.
And maybe to tie back to the art discussion, I think one of the big problems is that we don't have any story whatsoever. There's no mediums, music, television, especially literature, which is sort of my focus, that is telling any kind of redeeming, inspiring, meaningful.
What's inspiring
story.
You? Come on, I don't even believe this. What is? You've taken tremendous inspiration, for example, from Stoicism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You've rejected the postmodern story but you found a more ancient story, and this is what you've worked. I know a lot of you don't watch the conversations, but the conversations actually are part of the narrative flow of this channel. And my conversation with Bern Power, we talked about this, and Bern brought up the cargo cults. And what happens in postmodernity is that, in a sense, the hermeneutic of suspicion suggests that everything is a cargo cult. Suggests that the building of the plane and the tower, expecting for the World War troops to be the American troops to be coming back again, the association that isn't causality. Postmodernity says that's all that, and the only thing that's really moving underneath is this, exactly what Eric is complaining about, this selfishness. That's what really there is. And so even haunting behind Eric's complaint is some of the hermeneutic of suspicion, that these boomers, they're just really selfish. But now there's this cultural shift happened in the 60s, and we no longer believed silence, boomers, then there's a line, and they're not part of any story going above that line. And Ryan in this podcast will say many times, the founding fathers were just all grifters, and it's just one grift through another through American history, and Abraham Lincoln, and American history starts at 1619, and it's the whole story of America can just be summarized as trying to get labor out of slaves. And well, that's a narrative, but it's a darker narrative, and what Ryan is seeing here is that this narrative beneath it, once the happy days of the 1950s textbook propaganda are dispelled by the counterculture, well, what's left? We don't have any story whatsoever that is telling us any kind of redeeming, inspiring story. Now, then they'll get to talk about speaking with the dead. And let me see if that's coming up.
You've profiled, this is an incredibly weird, heroic story of Peter against Gawker, unless it's the reverse, in which case...
And what's in, because after listening to this, I thought, because I knew very little about Peter Thiel and Gawker and any of that, so I picked up Ryan's book and I'm really enjoying it. I mean, make a great movie too. Fascinating story, but the postmodern acid and acid of suspicion can make all of this just look seedy and grimy and not heroic.
It's the rich baron laying low the free press.
Yeah.
Either way that you tell that story, it's an effing amazing story.
Yeah, it's the story of good and evil, and
either way you assign it.
Yes, right. And that's what I was fascinated with. Who is the good guy, bad guy? Both characters have. But if you were telling the story in television today or something, the only way you would tell that story is Peter is irredeemably the bad guy, and I think what is the cultural, what's the primary theme of most of the culture that we're consuming today? I think it's nihilism. I think that everything is meaningless, everything sucks, everyone's a moral hypocrite, there is no good or bad, shouldn't judge other people's lifestyles. So I think we lack any kind of store, like what we've looked back at history,
right, and
gone, Abraham Lincoln's actually a racist, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson are total hypocrites, founding of America was based on fraud. Like we've looked back at, we've emptied all these things of meaning and replaced them with nothing, and then we wonder why everyone is content to burn down the system.
All right.
Powerfully said.
But you, sir, are not afflicted with this,
right? But I'm
Why?
I'm a throwback of some
No. You're of this moment. You're part of the same. I was very curious when you said your colleagues or your peers. Who are they? What's your firmament? What's your cohort?
I mean, I feel like I spend most of my time communicating with people that are dead. You
talk to the dead, and so do I.
Well,
now, what's going to be interesting here is that, okay, the Stoics, let's have a little bit of historical self-consciousness here. I would assert that he's reading the Stoics through Dominion, the Dominion that Tom Holland writes about. He's taken some of the Stoic wisdom, pragmatism, but mapped a Christian ethic of love and equality and generosity, because that's the dominant ethic, and it's so dominant, so dominantly Christian. It's not even recognized as Christian or religion or anything, but there it is, and that's the power of the Tom Holland's argument has put forward, that the Stoics, well, we're seeing the Stoics through Christianity here.
So Zeno is the founder of Stoicism. He goes to the Oracle of Delphi. He's a young man. He's this a merchant family. He's incredibly wealthy. He trades Tyrian purple, which is the purple dye that makes the emperor's cloak. And he stops at the Oracle of Delphi and he says, "What should I do with my life?" Basically, this is the timeless question.
Right.
And they say, "Your life, you will become your best self when you begin having conversations with the dead." And he shortly thereafter suffers a shipwreck, washes up in Athens, loses everything, and he walks into a bookstore, and the bookseller is reading a dialogue of Socrates, and he realizes, oh, this is the conversation with the dead. Socrates is dead, a few decades by the time this happens, and he realized, oh, I'm talking to Socrates, and this creates the school of philosophy that I now believe in.
Now let's take a look at what dialogue shall we pick? Well, let's pick the Republic. Are there gold, silvers, and bronzes around? No, we just finished talking about the idea of have a child, get married. Is that the idealized city within Plato's Republic? No, that's not at all what Plato's Republic looks like. So where are these things connecting? So you're reading the Greeks through the Christians. Well, someone might point to the patristics and church fathers and say, well, thank you, because they've done all that work for you, and you just inherit it, but you read it through the fathers, and you don't even see the fathers. But any Greek looking at you would see the difference.
This is the closing of the American mind. Is it Bloom?
Bloom.
We've destroyed the canon, replaced it with nothing. We destroyed the myths of the founding of America, replaced it with nothing. We questioned patriotism, replaced it with nothing. We tore down marriage, replaced it with nothing. We tore down the office, the community, the small town square, all of the things, we tore them down, and we've
getting very Mayberry-ish.
Replaced them with nothing. I feel like I'm rooted in those. I'm rooted in that more ancient tradition. That's to me where I find me.
Again, read Plato's Republic. It doesn't look like Mayberry.
You're rebuilding
me out of bed. I hope so.
Okay, so when you bathe your 3-year-old,
yeah, how's
your nihilism doing?
Oh, it's not. That's my point. And when I'm reading him Aesop's fables, or we go for a walk on our farm in the morning, or I drop him off for school in this small town in Texas that we live in, and
right.
I walk down Main Street, and my office is a 100-year-old building, and
that's not Plato's Republic. Now, what's amazing is that there's a whole bunch of people listening to this podcast who are conservative Christian homeschooling moms, and they're hearing this and they're eating it up with a spoon. And I remember this big movement in the 80s and 90s about getting back to the classics, but these classics are all filtered through Christendom. Okay? This is Tom Holland's devastating point. That's not the world of Sparta and Athens here, mind you, which was, filled with slaves.
I'm surrounded by ideas, and I think even podcasts, the idea of dialogue, this is what most of Socrates' work is the recreation of dialogues between smart people. Do you know what I mean? I feel like
the recreation of dialogues between Smart people.
That is
Well, this is what I'm doing.
That's our salvation.
That's our salvation. Salvation from what? Salvation from the nihilism. Fair enough. Why'd you use that word? Because if you were stroll into one of those little churches in your small town in Texas, of which there are many of them, a little Southern Baptist church, they'd be talking about salvation all over the place, and you'd be saying, I don't believe anything in your salvation. It's the dialogue of smart people where we find our salvation.
Salvation.
I've gone back to, I think, 1609 to find a drinking song for my I don't want to call them a cult, but the people who are coalescing around this podcast.
Yeah.
There are probably now 10 different performances of this song on a Google Drive.
Oh.
One like an EDM, another is a swing version. Somebody else has done like 3-part religious harmony.
Yeah.
Have to cruise over to the portal, hear that myself.
People want meaning. And the whole point that we can't get at is these open communities.
Again, where do Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein intersect? Here's a piece of it.
Where everybody can comment on YouTube and say, 3-part religious harmony.
Yeah.
People
Religious harmony.
want meaning. And the whole point that we can't get at is these open communities where everybody can comment on YouTube and say, you suck, you don't even get it, you're so far.
Okay, now watch the egalitarian, the populism sort of drip away here, leak away.
You got pawned.
Yeah.
That thing just needs to shut the fuck up, and we need to exclude it, because I think we've wildly overestimated diversity and inclusion. We need interoperability to allow for the diversity and exclusion. There's certain voices that we now need to just turn the volume all the way to 0. They can have their free speech.
Sure.
But it's very important that those voices not...
I'm a big fan of shadow banning.
I'm not a big fan of shadow banning, but...
Now there's a degree of irony with this part here, because again, in other places, some of Eric's big complaints are, I'm locked out of the citadel. I'm closed out of the circle. The powers that be and the corrupt places of power have kept the weirdos and the geeks, again, watch my conversation with Burn Power, and the nerds and the outliers and the radical thinkers and the smart people that are nonconformists are shut out. Well, what tools are he using? And who gets to decide?
Corporate interests
Sure.
who are doing it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of excluding people and heads on pikes when you actually have the
Heads on pikes?
conviction of why that person needs to be excluded from the community.
Yes, like for instance, I think like Twitter, instead of banning people, Twitter should tweak the algorithm to de-emphasize politics, let's say, and re-emphasize
Oh, so let's be sneaky in the way that we sandbag people.
photos of pizza or whatever. Like I think what we've allowed is toxic conversations or styles of conversations to dominate the town squares in a way that's made them almost unlistenable or made them.
I'd be curious to know what conversations he's talking about, because you see, and this is where nuance is complicated, because I mean Eric's other point is legitimate, that in some ways and this was the complaint against the 50s, that the public square was sanitized by the Ozzie and Harriet ethos of conformity. And that was the big anxiety in the 50s that George Marsden will write about in The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, of the corporate man and the empty suit. That, all this conformity and this shadow banning and, if I were to say, oh, we need to go back to closeting certain people. Well, I thought closets weren't good. Well, see, this gets really, really tricky and really, really difficult. And so
worthless.
Well, to your earlier point about public parks.
Yeah.
When a public park becomes a dangerous Hobbesian square.
When you let homeless people turn it into a camp.
Well, but I'm not even talking about necessarily homeless people. You know, if you have like a solid drug taking.
We're talking chaos and order here.
Community where people who have perfectly reasonable homes.
Yeah, you let high school kids drink in it or
whatever it is, you lose that.
Because Eric, again, in the institutions wants the nonconformists and the low in agreeableness in, because they can have divergent, creative, pattern disruptive thinking. But here in these other ways, well, we've really we need a strong hand to bring order to the community.
Original intent. So exclusion is trading at a discount at the moment because we have a fear that if anybody points out that inclusion as writ large is, you can't just stop at an idea that simple.
Yeah. What I love on Twitter is the mute button. I don't block people. I just mute the people that I don't want to hear from. And they don't know that they've been muted as far as...
Well, there's that, but the part of the problem is that people who are using these attacks on the lower brain. So, for example, if you have followers who start to say, "Wow, Ryan really is at an interesting point. I really like what he's developing," like, then you start getting these like weird accounts that are remoras on your shark.
Yeah,
and they're like, that blowhard has been mining the same passage from Seneca.
Yeah,
tell me something new. Did you read a new book today? Okay, so now you mute that. You don't realize that person is changing the experience.
They're right
for everyone else.
Are a great example of this. There's almost like a law that like a subreddit is formed by people who are fans of a thing,
right?
And then it becomes dominated by people who actually hate
this
that
process.
It's Judas.
It's like if you leave a dead body out, and then you put a time-lapse photography, time-lapse camera on it, you'll see this weird process by which the body is reclaimed.
It's the age of decay, baby. It's the age of decay. That's the world you're living in. All love is destroyed by betrayal or death. Every corporation that is built dies, maybe kills itself. Well, it's got more to say here that I wanted to catch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
That seems to be a feature of our time that I wish we were talking about, that anything hopeful and decent and meaningful left out in this.
It's not just a feature of our time. It's a feature of all times. It's a feature of the world we're living in. And it's not, we don't have the power to dispel it.
Environment.
Yeah.
Will be eroded and memified and cheapened and degraded simply by virtue of the fact that it was out there.
And this is where, with his conversation with Ross Douthat, would this happen to Jesus? It's a good question. Well, I've got some fat books on church history there that chronicle exactly this over the last 2,000 years.
And there is an aspect of saying there's a reason that we don't leave the original Constitution in an open air park.
It's protected under bulletproof glass and
hell yes.
Humidifier.
And the key point is, can you touch it? Oh, I don't understand. Why can't we touch it? We're the people.
What is the sacred? Does the sacred last? Can the sacred last?
Well, the people's like, no, you can't touch it. You just can't.
Right. Yeah, it's a sort of protection and enforcing of boundaries and norms. And
well, this is the thing. This is what has to start. I mean, I literally watched the moderators of one of these groups dedicated to this show, and they were in pains. I don't want to exclude anybody. I don't want to. It's just that heads on pikes.
Yeah.
Come on over to Bridges of Meaning. We do. Rick does have a band hammer, but not used too often. Culture. There are powerful ways for culture to correct some things.
Take the first real troll and make a public example of this person and their shittiness.
Right.
And
this is fascinating.
And let that, put that at the gates of the city wall so that everybody understands.
King Philip? Was it King Philip's War back in the Puritan days? How long did his head sit in that steel cage outside of, I don't remember which, was it Plymouth?
Exactly how you'll be asked to leave the community.
Right. No, that's a great point. Yeah, it's weird. I feel like, everyone...
And this is where being a pastor comes in real handy, because John Calvin says one of the 3 marks of the church is church discipline. But pastors, it's exactly these troublesome sheep that there's often tremendous potential for.
Everyone should have experience moderating an internet forum. Like because I did that as a sort of internet nerd.
Try pastoring a church
growing up, and so you're like, look, you gotta ban people, or you gotta get rid of people, or you have to insist on the rule. Like if there are rules, and you don't insist on people following that rule, it descends into anarchy immediately.
These are people who might have problems with the concept of hell talking. Again, very interesting.
I also think you need an injustice budget. Like, in other words, you can't move through the world. Like the Jains in India, they don't want to do any harm.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, well, no, you have to be allowed to do some injustice as you move through planet Earth.
Got it, sure.
And so the fact that so many people have an idea that they have to only have type 1 error and never have type 2 error is paralytic.
Well, so I wrote a piece a couple months ago about hunting, and...
Are you a hunter?
Yeah. I live on a little farm in Texas, mostly boars, because they're an enormous invasive species.
Okay.
But what I love, two things about it I love. One, if I took a picture of my breakfast this morning, people, oh, that's a delightful photo.
Right.
If I took a picture of a boar I shot, I'm a murderer, even though actually one is much less violent and cruel than the other, right? Bacon from a factory farm, sausage from a...
I encourage everyone to read The Walrus and the Carpenter poem of Lewis Carroll.
I haven't read this. I will.
The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings.
Cabbages and Kings, banner editorial, Eppinga for years. Little inside information.
Why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. You ever heard this?
No.
It's a dialogue between these two characters who trick a bunch of oysters into being their lunch.
Ah.
And one of them is very sad about the fact that they've done such a nasty thing. And the other one's like, oh, come on, we did it, whatever.
Yeah.
And I really detest... The question is, who do you detest more?
Yeah.
And I always detested the one with this sort of mock care and sanctimony and pity.
Yes.
Whereas other people have the idea, well, at least that's a nub of something to begin an empathic conversation.
Well, and that was my point in the article. It's not that everyone should hunt, but I feel like everyone should do it once, because you realize, oh, this is a complicated thing which brings up complicated emotions. You learn that food comes from life and death. And you learn that there is violence in the world, and that sometimes, your point about injustice,
and that you do violence. That's the much tougher lesson to learn.
Like, it is in one respect unjust to kill this animal. On the other hand, this is where food comes from. On the other hand, somebody else killed all the mountain lions and the wolves, and so now there's not a predator to kill these wild boar, which shouldn't be here. And so there's an unlimited population of them, and they are destroying the environment that you say that you care about.
Well, it's interesting also that people tend to think about the top and bottom of a food chain.
Yes.
And that the when you kill something in the middle of a food chain, you're killing a killer.
Yeah.
And, in some sense, you've preserved more life. Or,
Yeah.
Then there are all these ways in which you can argue that a vegetarian diet takes life in ways that you didn't expect. So you have to make contact with the fact that there is no way out.
That's exactly right. And I think, for instance, this might seem like a stretch, but so you go out, you hunt wild boar, you do it once, you get the experience that there's a certain amount of injustice, but this injustice prevents a greater injustice, blah, 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 blah. To me, like Austin is like San Francisco and like Los Angeles that's struggling with a housing crisis and homelessness. So Austin where I live, has had this long-standing belief that if we don't build infrastructure, what they are doing is rape and a number of other injustices are happening just right on the other side of town, but because they don't see it, they don't have to feel it, and so like people at the homeless crisis, and then they can.
I would imagine that you would recognize that you were one as well.
Yeah, no. In that example, it's
consequences.
Single family home is directly responsible for that homeless crisis.
Do you see your own hypocrisy clearly?
What I just said, or in my life?
No, just you're talking about benefiting.
You might stop and wonder what was the name of the guy who brought hypocrisy into the world conversation?
From things that are also having negative consequences. What is your relationship? I'm treating you as an advanced life form.
Yeah.
Where a bit of elitism here.
Where some other person would say, I'm not a hypocrite.
Yeah.
I, of course, am a hypocrite. I would imagine that you would recognize that you were one as well.
Yeah, no, in that example, it's like, look, I'm benefiting from it. It's like, look, I'm not a Trump supporter, but the Trump tax plan has been great for me, right? Like, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves about those things.
To the extent that we can be.
Yeah, and we should look for them and try to understand them, because I'm really one of my favorite quotes from Upton Sinclair is that it's really hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it.
Now, there's some portions I want to get to that I haven't gotten to yet, and there's some stuff got to kind of play through. Hopefully, don't make the video too long. I know, but just wanted to mark here. Heads on pikes, gotta ban people. Injustice budget, seeing hypocrisy clearly. I'm treating you as an advanced life form.
And so when you don't understand where you benefit from things, what your incentives are, you can drift towards a kind of a moral superiority, which is actually based on kind of ignorance.
A moral superiority.
But I'm sure I'm a hypocrite on a lot of things I don't know about. But I do try to be aware where I am good on both sides or whatever.
I mean,
again, these are such classic religious conversations. Take the mote out of your own eye before you can get the speck out of the other's eye.
I guess when I have all of these trade-offs in my life, I have to say that the idea of budgeting for badness, like we talked about an injustice budget. I have a hypocrisy budget.
Okay.
And I'm trying to live within my means. It doesn't mean that hypocrisy means nothing to me. It just means I've watched every other person make the accusation to someone else of hypocrisy. And I always think, I have so much metacognitive
You can become a Calvinist and be guilty of all of it. We call it total depravity.
Access. I'm watching my own hypocrisy constantly. And it's legendary. I mean, it's really large.
Yeah, I think it's like, let's try not to be a raging hypocrite rather than try to be utterly unhypocritical.
I mean, I think that's the right.
Or you can go the other way and just not care anymore. The way to deal with shame is to be, again, in the Gawker book, is to, you go the whole Gawker way, and it's like people are going to make moral charges, say moral schmoral.
Posture, and I think that in an online world, signing yourself up for being for truth, for goodness, for consistency.
Yeah.
You're just dooming yourself to fail. There's no possible way that you're going to leave a trail that isn't going to contradict itself many times over.
Yeah. And one of the Stoic ideas is sort of be strict with yourself and tolerant of others. We have it the exact opposite in our sort of media culture, especially. Like,
Okay, this is an important part I wanted to get to.
I always laugh at the sky is falling alarm of media people about the collapse of norms in politics. These are the same people who wake up every day and have been part of a generational collapsing of norms inside journalism, right? And so
I should note, just for my own hypocrisy budget, that the deacon just handed me my paycheck, so...
we can be... norm enforcement is not something you insist on other people do. It's something you follow. I think religious people get this wrong too. The Ten Commandments...
This is interesting, because again, I mean, where did we start this video? What is the focus on? What am I keeping in the back of my mind? Religiosity. So... religious people, it's not Eric, it's not Ryan. Who are these religious people? What do they do?
They're not forms inside journalism. Falling alarm of media people about the collapse of norms in politics.
So the media people are complaining about the collapse of norms in politics, while the norms of media are just going away. Now, if you ask about the norms of media, and you know, this conversation is very helpful for me understanding Eric's conversation with, oh no, that one got archived, with the guy who Eric didn't like his journalistic practices. But the journalists will say, well, we have no choice because newspapers are no longer the cash cows they were 20, 30 years ago. Newspapers used to be astoundingly lucrative businesses, and now newspapers are just, in fact, a neighbor of mine is a professional accountant, and one of his biggest clients is a newspaper conglomerate. And so I was having a conversation with him about newspapers and saying, yeah, newspapers used to be astoundingly profitable, and now they're just, you know, they're not without profit, but the margins are just far slimmer, and that change has been very hard on them. So it's always the justification of the injustice budget or the hypocrisy budget, which is where you should really look.
These are the same people who wake up every day and have been part of a generational collapsing of norms inside journalism.
Now it's really important because, and this is inescapable again. Am I just justifying my evil budget or my injustice budget? What these two are doing is pointing out the evil of other people. That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing, in fact, through a lot of this portion that I've just been playing.
Right? And so we can be... norm enforcement is not something you insist on other people do.
Norm enforcement is not something you insist on other people do.
It's something you follow. I think
it's something you follow. And now, here's the big tell.
Religious people get this wrong too. The Ten Commandments.
Religious people get this wrong too. Religious people. Who are these religious people? It's not Eric. It's not Ryan. They're not religious people. Who are the religious people? Religious people do this. It's norm enforcement is not what other people do. It's what you follow. But just 9 minutes ago, we've had heads on pikes, gotta ban people, an injustice budget, seeing your own hypocrisy clearly, treating you as an advanced life form. This is what religious people do. I'd say it's what we all do. What is this religious thing that we've bumped up against that we don't know? Back to a slide that I had in my unnecessary pastor video, which was last week's Monday video. This is this week's Monday video. In the late spring of 1960, Life, America's immensely popular pictorial magazine, claiming a readership of 25 million, published a crucial U.S. debate and 5-part series on the national purpose. The authors, a distinguished group, included not only professional observers of the national scene headed by the legendary Walter Lippmann, but also men of practical affairs such as David Sarnoff, head of the Radio Corporation of America, others such as poet Archibald MacLeish, recent 2-time Democratic presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson, and evangelist Billy Graham were among the most famous representatives of major areas of American life. It was unremarkable at the time that all these contributors were white males. So what was... Everyone was religious. In fact, to have high status was to be religious. In fact, the complaint that you can still hear from the likes of Matt Dillahunty or Sam Harris is that you don't have too many candidates out there saying, I'm an atheist. Whereas for a long time now, Jimmy Carter was probably one of the most devoted churchgoers, but Ronald Reagan, not so much. Bill Clinton, Southern Baptist. George W. Bush, personal relationship with Billy Graham, had a life-changing religious moment. Jimmy Carter, Sunday school teacher. Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump. We won't talk about him quite yet. It was unremarkable at the time that all the contributors were white males. It was also just as unremarkable that the forum included a clergyman, even though the clergyman was an ardent evangelical. Adlai Stevenson and Billy Graham could bat in the same lineup, along with business leaders. Religious had a function in that society that has been removed today. Now, would we argue that 1950s and 1960 was postmodern? No, it was modern. And religion supposedly removed for the sake of the naked public square. Well, when exactly did that removal happen? So, after spending some time with the portal with Eric and Ross Douthat, just sort of in passing, J.D. Vance said, at first I was going to do my book about religion and the religious nature of Meemaw, and that really caught my attention. They said, but Robert Putnam had just put out a book that was better on the same subject. I thought, what is that book? I haven't read that book. And we commented on this on the unnecessary pastor in the IDW. And so this week I jumped into Robert Putnam's book. In the 1950s, the Fraternal Order of Eagles teamed up with movie director Cecil B. DeMille for a unique promotion for the epic movie The Ten Commandments. In the form of reverse product placement, the Eagles and DeMille donated monuments of the biblical Ten Commandments to communities all around the country. Rather than putting a product in the movie, the primary symbol of the movie was instead placed in prominent locations, in public parks, in front of courthouses, and in the case of Texas, on the grounds of the state capitol. These monuments reflected the zeitgeist, as the 1950s brought public and even government-sanctioned expressions of religion to the fore in many ways. This was also the decade in which "In God We Trust" became the national motto, and the Pledge of Allegiance was amended to include "Under God." I've made this point in many videos, but in the context of Eric and Ryan's conversation, it becomes very interesting, because here we had Eric and Ryan. Well, how are people... What's the problem of the meaning crisis for people? They're disconnected, they're floating, and they're going down to this little town in Mexico, and they're trying psychedelics, and they're traveling, and if you listen to Tim Keller, they're creating idols in which to, but they want to get to something real. And so then both Eric and Ryan say what they should do is have a child and get married. Boy, it's sort of a return to the 50s. And it's stronger in Dave Rubin than anyone else in the IDW sphere, frankly. Ben Shapiro to a degree too. These monuments stood for decades without causing a fuss. In recent years, however, now this book was published in 2010. A lot of the research was done in 2006, 2007. But in recent years, they have led to court battles over whether their location on publicly owned land violates the constitution of a government establishment of religion. In other words, 50 years, these displays were so non-controversial that they could safely be used as a marketing ploy for a big-budget Hollywood movie. Now they are the subject of litigation all the way to the Supreme Court. Something has changed. And if you look at the two sides, religiosity, which David Putnam will go into here, is a big deal. Because religiosity, this is along the lines of religiosity will be where people line up with respect to there should be the Ten Commandments in the Supreme Court or in the courthouse. Something that, if you go back to Unbelievable with Richard Dawkins, is one of the things that drew his ire. This is one of the things that repeatedly draws the ire of the freedom from religion or the celebrity atheist tribe. But again, in the 1950s, this was simply a promotional ploy by a movie. They didn't put products in the movie. They put products on the courthouse, and everybody said, yeah, why? Well, we're fighting godless communism. Now it's interesting that this world, mid-century modern, gets brought up in a Coen Brothers movie. And as is often the case, if one of my kids, I've got 3 of them living at home right now for the pandemic, 2 of them finishing up college, or not finishing up, one in the middle and one finishing up college from at home. And these were kids that started their educational experience being homeschooled. So we just toss the remote to one of the kids and say, watch what you want to watch. And so they go through Netflix or Amazon. And my son, the youngest, picks Hail Caesar. I'd never heard of the movie. Thought, well, this is interesting. And then I start watching the movie, and it's just a star-studded movie. You've got these big-name, expensive, high-profile, high-status Hollywood stars in this movie. This weird movie about Hollywood in the 50s making Jesus-y movies like The Ten Commandments or The Robe or any of these films. And the movie mogul has such a tender conscience. He's in confessional every day. And I've actually been having a conversation with Matthew Miller, who had the conversation of the Logos Made Flesh video. He does movie symbolism, and he saw the movie too, and it caught his attention too, and he really sort of opened my eyes to a bunch of elements of it. Might not be a movie he does, because he only does, usually he doesn't do many videos like I do, but he does movies that everyone has seen, and not very many people saw this movie, but it's by the Coen brothers. And so here we are, kind of coming back around, back to a fascination with this period. And by people who should be, like Eric Weinstein, far on the left. Whoops. Something has changed. In 1960, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy had to reassure Protestants that they could safely vote for a Catholic. At the time, 30% of Americans freely told pollsters that they would not vote for a Catholic as president. At the same time, Kennedy won overwhelming support from his fellow Catholics, even though he explicitly disagreed with the church on a number of political issues. Now, from what we know of JFK, also Me Too, JFK, the dude was a sex addict. In 2004, America had another Catholic presidential candidate, also a Democratic senator from Massachusetts, also a highly decorated veteran, also with the initials JFK. Like Kennedy, John Forbes Carey also publicly disagreed with his church on at least one prominent issue, in this case, abortion. Well, we might have Joe Biden, another Democrat, Roman Catholic, disagrees on abortion. But unlike Kennedy, Carey split the Catholic vote with his Republican opponent and lost handily among Catholics who frequently attend church. In other words, you've got the category of Catholic, but you've got the category of religiosity. And, well, you're a Catholic. Do you go to church? Even how do you feel about the Pope? Where's Ross Douthat? But unlike Kennedy, Kerry split the Catholic vote with his Republican opponent and lost handily among Catholics who frequently attend church. Kennedy would likely have found it inexplicable that Kerry not only lost to a Protestant, but in George W. Bush, an evangelical Protestant at that. Writing about the religious tensions manifested in the 1960s campaign, political scientist Philip Converse described the election as a flash of lightning which illuminated, but only momentarily, a darkened landscape. Kerry's candidacy was another flash of lightning, but the landscape it revealed had changed significantly. In 1960, religion's role in politics was mostly a matter of something akin to tribal loyalty. Catholics and Protestants each supported their own. In order to win, Kennedy had to shatter the stained glass ceiling that had kept Catholics out of national elective office in a Protestant majority nation. Do a little Googling and find out how many Roman Catholics currently sit on the Supreme Court. How many waspy Protestants sit on the Supreme Court. This has changed recently with some Trump appointees, but the point is clear. By the 2000s, how religious a person is had become more important as a political dividing line than which denomination he or she belonged to. Church-attending evangelicals and Catholics and other religious groups, too, have found common political cause. Voters who are not religious have also found common cause with one another, but on the opposite end of the political spectrum. Again, something has changed. Religion's role in America thus poses a puzzle. How can religious pluralism coexist with religious polarization? Because we've got both. And the way is practice, religiosity. This state of flux has actually contributed to religious polarization. A fluid religious environment enables people seeking something different to leave one religion for another, to find religion for the first time, or to leave religion altogether. Now again, even religion in this category, when we talk about this, we should keep Tom Holland's observation in mind about the fact that Christianity permeated the world. One was on top, which was confessional, formal, religious practice, religiosity, going to church, propositional beliefs, all of these things, and then a sneaky under thing that penetrated, and suddenly Hindus had a religion, and Buddhists had a religion, and there were people without a religion. This is the other stream that happens underneath, and it completely conquers the entire world because everybody was paying attention to this. Oh, look at the religion over here. But now you have the category of religion. And once you have the category of religion, well, now you have religious and non-religious. And so Eric and Ryan can talk comfortably as non-religious people, even though Eric sometimes goes to synagogue. But they're very much on the non-religious side. My dyslexia always gives me problems when I try and do these physical illustrations. The malleable nature of American religion, however, means that these clusters, this churn means that people gradually but continually sort themselves into like-minded clusters. Their commonality defined not only by, it should be a religion, but also by the social and political beliefs that go along with their religion. The malleable nature of American religion, however, means that these clusters are not bunkers. Instead, the same fluidity that contributes to religious polarization means that nearly all Americans are acquainted with people of a different religious background. Even if you personally have never gone through a religious change, you likely know someone who has. Furthermore, that someone is likely to be more than a passing acquaintance, but rather a coworker, a close friend, a spouse, or a child. All of this religious churn produces a jumble of relationships among people of varying religious backgrounds, often within extended families and even households, which keeps religious polarization from pulling the nation apart. In other words, There's tremendous religious diversity and tremendous religious pluralism, but we're not segregated into the kinds of communities that you could see, let's say, in North Jersey at the beginning, or when I was growing up. You had, the blacks living in Patterson, and the Jews in Fair Lawn, and the Italians in Haledon and North Haledon, and the Dutch in Prospect Park. But in fact, Prospect Park, New Jersey was called Dutch Hill, and there were so many CRCs in that little 1 square mile of Prospect Park. And eventually they migrated out into the suburbs, and the ghettos sort of melted and formed into one another and broke down, and we had integration. But the integrations were not just along skin color lines. Over the last 50 years, American religion has thus experienced two countervailing transformations. The first is the emergence of a new religious fault line in American society. Left on its own, such a fault line could split open and tear the nation apart. The second change, however, was precisely why the fault line has not become a gaping chasm. Polarization has not been accompanied by religious segregation in terms of the religious labels that people have. Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, spiritual but not religious. Polarization has not been accompanied by religious segregation, either literally or even metaphorically. To the contrary, rather than cocooning into isolated religious communities, Americans have become increasingly likely to work with, live along, and marry people of other religions, or people with no religion at all. Now, just as colonialism and changes throughout Christian story kind of created a two-track transformation of the world. We had the visible religion up here and the idea that religion itself is a thing. Well, these things are continuing to move on in interesting ways. Americans had become increasingly likely to work with, live alongside, and marry people of other religions, or people of no religion at all. In doing so, they have come to accept people with a religious background different from their own. Okay, that's in terms of the labels that are up here, up on top. But underneath, practice. It is difficult to demonize the religion or lack of religion of people you know, and especially those you love. Indeed, interreligious relationships are so common that most Americans probably pay them little mind and consider them unremarkable. That's a very big difference from the 1950s and 1960s. Very big difference. I remember the terror in the minds of my aunts that my cousins would marry Catholic girls. And part of the reason the Christian Reformed Church had Christian schools was whenever the new crop of Christian school teachers, who were usually young women graduating from Christian college, would come into the community, my aunts would perk up and watch and really hope that one of their sons would marry a Christian school teacher and not a Catholic girl from the village. Interreligious relationships are so common that most Americans probably pay them little mind and consider them unremarkable. But their very commonness makes them remarkable indeed. I didn't place this in, but there's a very interesting article in the New York Times of a lesbian couple who wanted to sue a rabbi because he wouldn't marry them. Now, what was interesting about the article was it wasn't that he wouldn't marry them because they were lesbians. He wouldn't marry them because one attended synagogue and the other considered herself Catholic. In other words, the rabbi paid attention to the labels and the women were horrified. He said, well, I don't mind marrying two women, but she's got to become a Jew before I marry you. And there they are in the New York Times, bigger than life, complaining about the bigotry of this rabbi. States, in general, Americans have high rates of religious belonging, behaving, and believing. Now we're going to get into the question of what do we mean by religious? How can we suss that out? Well, sociologists, political scientists like Putnam, he has to figure out a way into this conversation because it's very tricky. And there are a lot of pitfalls in here. What social scientists call 3 B's of religiosity. That'll become an important word. Now, it's very interesting how these 3 B's of religiosity, belonging, behaving, believing, well, they're fairly mappable on Vervaeke's 4 P's of knowing. Participatory, perspectival, procedural, and propositional. I put them all down so I wouldn't forget one of them, which I usually do. These are how we measure religiosity. And the goal of this book is going to be to track religiosity across the religious labels. Okay? And again, this isn't so dissimilar. Oh, don't I have this book here? Yes, I do. This isn't so dissimilar to what Christian Smith was doing in Soul Searching. Soul Searching by Christian Smith. When he discovered that all of these American young people, whether they had religious labels of Catholic, Baptist, Reformed, Buddhist, Muslim, no religion in the household, were all moralistic therapeutic deists. In other words, the religious labels are meaningful, but they're not the whole story. And so in this book, they want to have a new thing to track called religiosity. 83% of Americans report belonging to a religion. 40% report attending religious services nearly every week or more. Now remember, these statistics were from 2006-2007. They would have shifted quite a bit more towards the nuns since then, but this will become part of the story, obviously. 59% pray at least weekly. A third report reading scripture with some frequency. Many Americans have also have firm religious beliefs. 80% are absolutely sure there is a God. 60% are absolutely sure there is a heaven. Although fewer, 52%, have this level of certainty about life after death, which is remarkable. I know there's a heaven, but I'm not sure there's life after death. That's just the way how people are. And as a pastor, you know this because you talk to people, and pastors have a grid, a framework that they're using to converse with people, sort of like doctors. When you go and doctor asks how you're feeling, he's listening for certain key words to map you on his grid. Well, pastors do this all the time. I believe my friends are in heaven. Do you believe in life after death? I'm not so sure, Pastor. Okay. That's just how people are. Slightly fewer, 49%, are certain that there is a hell. So there's heaven and... Well, did everybody go there? Don't start that discussion on the Discord server. Yet it is also important to note that not every American is so religious or religious at all. After all, 15% never attend religious services. 70% do not identify with a religion. Now, these numbers get significant upgrade between 2006 and 2018 or 19, when the more recent Pew study was done. After all, 20% are not certain about the existence of God. 40% are not sure there is a heaven. 48% are not certain there is life after death. Now, remember Jordan Peterson at Lafayette College? What's a religion? All this stuff that you say you believe in stuff. It's what you do are the religious practices. Now we're kind of coming full circle around to Tom Holland because, again, in some ways the word religion isn't in the Bible. Well, what is worship? Well, that's bowing down. It's what you do. Do you ever get on your knees and fall on your hands in front of something? That would be a very biblical way of asking whether or not you're religious. Now, even many Christians don't bow the knee anymore. By any objective standard, this profile shows the reasonably high religiosity of the United States. That profile appears even stronger when the United States is compared to the rest of the planet, especially other industrialized democratic nations. The United States ranks far ahead of virtually all other developed nations in terms of all three B's of religiosity. To make an example, Figure 1.1 displays how Americans compare to the rest of the world in a measure of religious behavior, namely weekly attendance of religious services. Indeed, in this global ranking of religious observance, America edges out even the Iran of the Ayatollahs. Now think about that. America is more religious than Iran. Now, my Persian friends, Ali, Kevin, I don't know if Kevin's listened to my videos or not, but when I talk to my Persian friends who have come out of Iran, well, that bears in mind. Well, what do you think of Islam? Once we got out of Iran, it was like, I don't got to go to mosque anymore. The United States also has an equally high degree of belonging and believing. For instance, 38% of Americans report being an active member of a church or religious organization, compared with only 16% of Australians, 9% of Italians, 4% of the French. Now, Italians and French, deeply Roman Catholic country, but as we're going to see, identity and practice change, and that Atlantic Ocean seems to transform people. Likewise, while nearly 47% of Americans affirm that religion is very important in their lives, only 17% of the Swiss, 12% of the Dutch, and 9% of the Swedes say the same thing. And so then they have these questions to gauge religiosity. How frequently do you attend religious service? How frequently do you pray outside of religious service? How important is religion in your daily life? They didn't ask spirituality. How important is your religion to your sense of who you are? Are you a strong believer in your religion? How strong is your belief in God? There's that question. Since the nature of what it means to be religious is inevitably fraught with ambiguity and controversy, it's important to keep a few things in mind about this method of measuring religiosity. First, some readers may wonder whether, say, frequency of attendance of a worship service, a public activity, really taps into the same concept as frequency of prayer, often done in private, and whether these two types of behaving really align with measures of belief like the existence of God. It is true that these index items are logically distinct, but in practice they are tightly bound together. Nearly all people, 99%, who say that religion is very important in their lives are also absolutely certain that they believe in God. Most people, 79%, who attend religious services also pray at least once a day, and so on. In other words, through their correlation, they've discovered that these things cohere. And part of this has to do, again, with the cultural background. In the 1950s, when there was all this having children and getting married and all of that stuff that some say, oh, we're glad we got rid of all that. Going to church gave you social status. Now, that varies to a degree by where you're living in the country. Coasts, you'll probably lose status in some ways. Bible Belt, you might gain some status, but it all depends on who. It's a far more complex situation. Again, as I've said many times, during the Cold War, what was assumed to be biblical morality was in alignment with church culture, and church people might be prudes or too uptight, but at least there was a basic alignment about what morality looked like. That changes after the Cold War. Second, keep in mind that this index does not rest on the inclusion or exclusion of a particular item. For example, excluding how frequently someone prays does not change the substantive results contained therein one whit. Likewise for any other individual item in the index. In other words, you get 5 out of 6, you're religious. The fact that religiosity does not hinge on a single measure underscores that together these different questions are tapping into a common underlying concept. Third, Readers may wonder whether these particular questions favor one religion or another. This is a common concern when the social scientists study religion, as religiosity is sometimes measured with questions that are normative within Protestantism, specifically for evangelicals. Some such indices include items that ask whether the Bible is inerrant or whether the respondent has been born again. Now again, pay attention to my God number one, God number two, born again, Charles Colson. That was an incredibly important movement that showed the evolution of and the evolution out of the main line of religiosity, okay, and really the fall of the main line, which has happened again since this after the 60s. Such questions are distinctively Protestant as keeping. Such questions are as distinctively Protestant as keeping kosher is distinctively Jewish. Our religiosity index avoids the problem of parochialism by including only items that could apply to all religious traditions. Now, this is going to get a little complicated a little later on, and some of you see this going. We're talking 2020 instead of 2010 with respect to the makeup of American religious practice. Still, we acknowledge the concern that perhaps this particular religiosity index is inadvertently biased towards evangelical Protestantism or some other religious tradition. But now they're going to look at the religiosity scale, and this is where it gets interesting, because Mormonism, highest in religiosity, not Jack Mormons, of course. Black Protestants, second. Evangelical Protestants, third. And then almost disappearing, mainline Protestants, and even after them, Catholics, barely religious. Now, how this will work out in statistics is that there are shadow sides of the balance, okay? And so that's what's undermining the religiosity. Other faiths, not high in religiosity at all, negative in fact. Jewish, 0.5 negative. Nuns, greater than negative 1.0. First, but this varies, of course, according to gender as well, or sex. Women are modestly but consistently more religious than men. According to the 2006 Faith Matters survey, women are more likely to say that they consider themselves to be spiritual and to report having experienced the presence of God. Okay, now we're getting the spiritual but not religious. These are going to really come up much more in studies done at the end of the teens. But in religiosity, there still is some correlation there. And this is only the beginning. More women than men say that right and wrong should be based on God's law rather than views of society. Women are more likely to believe that God created the world less than 10,000 years ago. Women are more frequently say that there are clear guidelines to good and evil. More women than men believe that the world will end soon, and that Scripture is the literal word of God, and that everyone will answer for their sins. Women read Scripture, talk about religion, read religious books more than men. And if you don't believe that, look at the church library, which is mostly composed of books read by congregational members who didn't want them taking up shelving space in their house anymore and thought someone else might like them and so gave them to the church. We have a huge section of religious romance and Christian fiction that I've never seen a man read. You get the point. No matter the specific yardstick, women exhibit a greater commitment to, involvement with, and belief in religion. Now, this gets very interesting because in sort of the religious left, all of the emphasis is on give women more power. And now after women, in terms of American religiosity, black Americans, far more religious than white Americans. Immigrants, far more religious than people born here. And so what's happening in a lot of these churches that are sort of moderate, they have both evangelical and mainline emphases, and we see this in the Reformed Church of America right now. The Christian Reformed Church of America was sort of the mother denomination out of which the Christian Reformed Church split off of. But You see this happening, and you find people on the left saying, we need to give the blacks and the women and the immigrants a greater voice, and we need to fly the rainbow flag. Well, guess who keeps taking the rainbow flag down? It's religiosity, because some of the typical social political things that are cohering in this are evolution, abortion, homosexuality pre-2013. Whether or not this is going to change is going to be very interesting to see as the decades go forward. And beliefs, believing in God and believing in the afterlife. In other words, the people that the religious left want to put in power are undermining key elements of their own agenda. And I see this all the time. This was well manifest in the United Methodist controversy a year or two ago. Another element that I learned from this book, which is particularly important in this question of religiosity, is American congregationaling. You have adulting? Well, this is congregationaling. The centrality of the congregation and its Protestant influence can be seen in how immigrants' religions adapt to the American religious ecosystem upon arriving in the United States. Even faiths that are not organized around the congregation in other nations come to adopt a congregation-based structure here in the United States. This goes to Putnam's previous book, Bowling Alone. From there, it is a small step to adopting many of the same practices as American, especially Protestant, congregations. For example, Islamic mosques in the U.S. often hold Sunday school or provide a social hall for community events, not what they typically do in other nations. In the U.S., imams are frequently called upon to serve as counselors and to engage in public relations, responsibilities outside the purview of imams elsewhere, but common to many congregational leaders in the United States. Alan Wolfe, a keen observer of religion in America, describes the contrast between mosques in America versus those Muslim-majority nations. Without intermediaries that stand between the believer and God, Islam has not traditionally had churches in the way Christians understand the term. Rather than a congregation with a fixed membership, mosques in Muslim societies were and continue to be convenient places into which one steps in order to pray, depending on where one is in the current course of the day. But in the United States, mosques inevitably come to resemble churches. Now go back to Eric's comment about have a baby, go to church, synagogue, or mosque, even if you don't believe. Mosques, I don't know about synagogues, but to a certain degree, even Roman Catholic churches in other countries are different than here. In America, to be a thing means you belong to the institution of a thing, and in that context you cohere with its practices, and down the line you're likely going to cohere with its beliefs. Not anywhere nearly as tightly as people imagine, and again, if you're a pastor in a church, you know this, but there's coherence nevertheless. Congregationalization is not limited to Muslims. For example, Hindu temples in the United States also have a church-like feel to them, even though Hinduism, like Islam, is not typically organized within a local congregation. In other words, again, you have the top religion that everybody sees, and you have the bottom secular, the implicit assumption that religion is a thing that can be separated from life. And as Tom Holland notes, a very perceptive Hindu scholar noted that while the Hindus did not embrace churches, now suddenly everyone had a religion, and to be Hindu and to be Muslim in the Great Partition is a different thing. Now suddenly the world is full of religious categories. That is playing itself out now as Eric and Ryan are trying to figure out a religion that's not a religion, because now religion is a category, and we've had Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and all these things, but none of these things fit, so we need that thing. Writing back in 1948, a sociologist described American Buddhist communities as having congregational bodies analogous to those which appear in contemporary Christianity, and particularly Protestant churches. Furthermore, these individual congregations were in no way reminiscent of the temple structure of the Japanese homeland. Go back and look at that video about Japan and religion that I played in a number of videos ago. With congregations as the dominant mode of religious organization, religious communities are a common nexus for friendships. Whether because one becomes a member of a congregation or finds friends there, or one makes friends and then joins the congregation, a majority of Americans, 56% to be precise, have at least one close friend in their religious congregation. You don't have a guild, well, you might. Neighborhood congregation, American congregationing. Now, back to this little podcast. Stoics aren't religious. So what you've got is all of these people that Eric is talking about, the same people that Jordan Peterson turned the lights on for, very many of the same people that are in the Bridges of Meaning Discord and are watching my videos. Well, what happened with Jordan Peterson is people began to become religious, and they began to become really religious, because to join the Orthodox Church, not a small deal. I mean, to join the Roman Catholic, not cradle Catholic who never goes to church, like, or cradle Catholics like John Kerry or Joe Biden, who don't have a problem not going along with the church on birth control or abortion. Well, something's going on. But Stoics, they're not religious. Well, if you ask N.T. Wright, what are the two major religious groups in the Roman Empire in which Christianity eventually toppled? He'll say Epicureans and Stoics. But now we throw in some Tom Holland, and the Stoics didn't think of themselves as a religion. The Epicureans didn't think of themselves as a religion. The category of religion or religiosity didn't exist. There was no Judaismos. Christianismos started the category with the top layer manifestation. Is having babies religious? Be fruitful and multiply. Religious people try putting their religions on others. Norm enforcement is for yourself. But again, go back to 111. Eric Weinstein questions the biggest distortions wrestling with in our minds are resolution that catapults us to different understandings of the environment, the portals, the sacraments. Peers say unrootedness, untetheredness. They are looking for something elsewhere, something beneath the surface. What's on the other side of the portal? What's on the other side of the sacrament? Looking for peace, meaning in psychedelics, polyamorous relationships, traveling, influence. Eric says that he's got the same list. The solution to elite angst and anxiety and alt-right anger and fear is getting married, having children, live with it, live within your means, find work that's purposeful. What you were looking for is family and joining a local mosque, church, synagogue, whether you believe it or not. He's advocating congregationaling. Isn't that interesting? But not religious. Oh, but if you start the practice, things start to cohere. So what is non-religious behavior? So of course I do my little sleuthing and, oh, look, I didn't know this. Ryan Holiday has a YouTube site and he has a podcast and he's teaching Stoicism. And again, it's so interesting because the Stoicism is, well, it's not a religion. It's not a religion. Don't tell me Stoicism is a religion. And the Stoics didn't believe they were doing religious things. But the moral framework on top of it is humanism, which is Christianity light. And when I looked at like 7, this was sort of the key video that he had on the main page when you go to his channel, and I listened to it, and it was wonderful. 7 key teachings of Stoicism you need to know. Why do you need to know it? This is what you need to do to live. This is wisdom, and a lot of great wisdom. Always do the right thing. The summum bonum. Virtue is the most important thing. The Stoic loves everything. Have low expectations. The obstacle in the way is the way. Ego is the enemy. We are all interrelated. Remember your mortality. I shouldn't say meditate on your morality. Meditate on your mortality. But look at the lines. Here's the thing. So if I were to ask many and say, are you religious? No, I'm not religious. I'm a Stoic. Well, what is a Stoic? A Stoic is a practice, and these are the practices that I do. Now we're back into John Vervaeke's Religio. I'm going to bind myself to these practices. But nothing supernatural, no life after death. I'm in the iron box of secularity. This is how I can make life work. And I don't need heaven, and I don't need hell, and I don't need a God. I just need my discipline. Okay. It's pretty religious. So what are we talking about with these words? Over the last 2 years, as I've had a lot of conversations and listened to a lot of people, basically the lines around religion are these, at least as some groups imagine. Recognize there's no personal agency nor intentionality above a human being. We recognize it in human beings. Human beings can have conspiracies, but evolution is blind. Now, this, of course, is where Jordan Peterson begins, and Bret too, but Jordan Peterson especially begins to muddy the water because he says, well, if you buy Darwin, because the Darwinian assumption is essentially this one. And if you read The Metaphysical Club, one of Jordan Peterson's recommended books, that point, I've made it in plenty of videos, so I'm not going to read the quote. That point is made strongly that what happened with Darwin is not so much evolutionary progression. There are a lot of people imagining that. It's that it's blind. It's that there's no intentionality in the mechanism. And that point is intentional, because if there's no intentionality in the mechanism, then there's no angst or hurt or grievance that I would have against a God who designed a world in which there's so much bloodshed. So, no personal agency nor intentionality above a human being. Assume no significant personal agency nor intentionality apart from human beings. Okay? None above us, none apart from us. We're alone in the cosmos. Now we're getting into Vervaeke's meaning crisis. And point 3, which they would double down on, no miracles. Things that can be done that you can't imagine. No breaking the laws of physics, as if we know what these laws are. Now, what we're doing is we're writing down the patterns, the majority patterns, and the patterns against which people in a certain group will swear can't be broken. But if you ask most people, they'll say, oh yeah, there are miracles. Most people will say that. But why? That's why C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, starts with that point. All these are unproven assumptions that operate as the implicit religion of secularity. They are increasingly exposed as such. What they are, in many ways, are the framing tenets of science, of the removing the eyeball of the manifest image and looking only, through the eyeball of science. As Jordan Peterson says, you strip out all of these things so you can do science. And that's good. And that's right. And that's true. But then it becomes scientism. And you say, this is the world. Wait a minute. It's a world of your own making because you stripped all the other things out. You took out one eye, Odin, in order to gain a vision. People who cling to them do so because they're afraid to let them go. Because they're afraid that when we go beyond this, well, if you start crossing these lines, and increasingly, these lines are the religious line. If you start crossing these lines, well, then you don't have the kind of certainty that you imagine you have with science. But that word gets pasted on a whole lot of things. What is the fear? Eric himself articulated the fear. I had been trying to put this into a sentence, and then I heard Eric say, and I wrote it down right quick because he identified it perfectly. It's better if there's no God, because if there is a God, you have to worry about what's on his mind. Again, go back and look at where the line is. There's no personal agency or intentionality above human beings to which we can find the world accountable. So there's no plan in the world. It happens without intentionality, without purpose. It just is. There's no significant agency apart from human beings. And there's no miracles, which in some way, the third point is just a more colloquial way of saying the first 2 points. Because if there is intentionality above us, and if there is intentionality which made the universe and has designs on it and has reasons for it and desires and expectations from it, well, you'd better worry. You'd better worry a lot, because it's better if there is no God, because if there is a God, you'll have to worry about what's on his mind and what he thinks about you. And so when we look at the deconstructions that have happened, and again, I've made a variety of videos about this too, the deconstructions, it's usually people who, well, it's the problem of evil. Well, I thought God was nice, and if God let Meemaw die the way she did, that God isn't nice, so I can't believe in that God anymore. It's kind of Darwinianism as an emotional reflux brought down to me. Now, what I want to do is run through an argument that I made to John Vervaeke, and he gave a critique on it. This happened last year. Why relate to a personal God? Now, I've continued to work on things and understand God in contrast to the meta-divine realm, which is, what Ezekiel Kaufman, a Jewish scholar, worked up in his work on the religion of Israel. And my argument is not so much an argument about God's ontology. It's an argument about wisdom. That this is how to be a human being. And in that sense, it's sort of parallel to Ryan's. Now, I obviously have beliefs that go beyond this. Beliefs about the ontology of God. And the more I play with these ideas, the more I recognize the sneaky trickiness of the ontological argument. Because, as many have noted, it doesn't really... people don't find the ontological argument, the being greater than which I can conceive. They don't find it compelling in terms of making them believe in a God. But my argument is more that you're better to act as if there is human agency above human beings. You're better off acting as if there is intentionality apart from human beings. You're better off acting as if there are miracles, because in a sense, as Jordan Peterson noted, most atheists say, give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest. And the miracle they want to be given is, of course, the Big Bang. Well, we're going to push that back to the multiverse. The more I think about the multiverse scheme, the more I think if you really want to maintain your atheist credentials, don't go there. I won't talk about that now, but that'll probably come up as I continue to think about that. And so this essentially is the argument I presented to John Vervaeke. And at the end, John said, and you can find that video, I'll put a link to it here. At the end, John said, yeah, but it doesn't really talk about ontology. I said, yeah, that's right. This is essentially a wisdom argument. And I'm borrowing from Jordan Peterson, and acting as if. Now, let's begin with Pascal, because, and I forget the guy's name who has a good video on this. Pascal basically said there's two modes of the mind. There's the spirit of geometry. Sadler is the guy who has videos, philosophy videos. He has a good video on this. There's the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse. And what's really interesting is that Pascal was observing something sort of parallel to Ian McGilchrist's observation about the two hemispheres. That one hemisphere seems to deal, the right hemisphere seems to deal with the chaos of the world, the limitlessness, and the other tries to bring order to it. But you sort of need both. And so Pascal makes the observation that you need both of these approaches to the world. You need the spirit of geometry. Now think about what spirit is here. Spirit is this thing which colonizes our behavior. So if the spirit of Aphrodite or Cupid takes a hold of me, I fall in love. I lose my agency to this spirit. And so the spirit are the modes of being. So we have a spirit of geometry and a spirit of finesse. And these are also two modes of regard. Okay? So these are not only modes of mind, but modes of regard and modes of approach. Some things I approach with the spirit of geometry, such as math, or my car, when I turn the key. I approach that with the spirit of geometry. Other things I approach with the spirit of finesse, with sometimes great fear and trembling, and those things might include my wife, or might include Uncle Sam. Now, again, there's an interesting correlation between the two hemispheres of the brain. In a sense, the left brain is the spirit of geometry. It's mapped territory. And the right brain is the spirit of finesse. It's unmapped territory. Now, to bring in one of my favorite C.S. Lewis books, Miracles, a brief introduction. Naturalism, at least certain varieties of it, act as if, okay, we're acting as if. Naturalism acts as if the universe is the whole show. It's one gigantic chain of cause and effects, problems fitting ourselves. Now, what this causes are problems of fitting ourselves into this universe. And this is exactly where the meaning crisis comes from. If everything is just one long chain of cause and effects, then I am just one long chain of cause and effects. And if you go to Bret Weinstein and Sam Harris's conversation on Bret's channel, this is what they keep bumping into, because what Patch, my nickname for Sam, does is he just keeps switching eyes. One eye is the manifest vision, to follow Wilfrid Sellers. Daniel Bonavac illustrates this in videos I point to often. The manifest image, in which there's causality, purposeness, ought. And the other is the scientific image, where there is no ought. There just is. And Wilfrid Sellers says, well, to live in the world, you have to have both eyes. Well, the problem with this is human beings, what are we to make of them? What are we to make of their purpose? Is it an illusion? Are we just watching the movie, hoping it ends well, as Sam says? Well, and what Lewis charges is that we don't act as if the scientific vision is true. We live within the manifest image. And in fact, Lewis would assert, and I would agree, that the scientific image is embedded within the manifest image, not the other way around. But what an ardent materialist says is that the scientific image is the dominant frame and the manifest image is the dependent frame. And it's that polarity which in many ways is increasingly the line between religiosity. I'm going to argue that you should act as if it's the other way around. You might as well, because you frankly already do. Now, I'm going over some stuff that I did a lot of last year, and you can find some of this in the glossary on the Bridges of Meaning, glossary about my work. Group A and Group B. Group A are colonizable things, non-intentional things. My cell phone stand, who I've hasn't appeared in many of my videos recently. This is the steel in this thing was colonized, was informed by human beings. It's a dead thing, okay? I put dead in scare quotes there. Materialists think that the whole universe can be reduced, the whole show, to a long causal chain of these things. Even living things are really only Group A things that are in denial or in confusion about themselves. Everything is Group A. The whole show, all the way down. Okay? That's, if you say that, then the scientific image, the scientific vision is the dominant frame, and the manifest image is an illusory frame within the dominant frame. And you can approach everything with the spirit of geometry. You can always deconstruct it and figure it out. Group B are colonizing agents, intentional agents, living beings. They alter their environment. And watch a really interesting conversation on Unbelievable where James Tour is there. Because that conversation, remember when Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris got bogged down in terms of knowing? These two get bogged down in terms of what exactly is life? It's a very interesting question. There are things in the universe that colonize other things on purpose and for purpose. Now again, if you're in the frame we were talking about before, only human beings are in Group B. There's nothing above them, nothing apart from them. Many of these things are complex, principalities, and fractalicious. What is fractalicious? Fractalicious is just given to fractalness. And these things in Group B ought to be approached with the spirit of finesse. Now, you can be a thoroughgoing materialist and say the dominant frame is the scientific image, and the manifest image is a subframe. That's basically Sam Harris's argument. And still approach things within Group B. But Group B is always a subset of Group A. Because fundamentally, everything is dead. Except you're having a temporary living experience, but you're really dead. And you're having an experience of will, but there really is no will. Because it's the whole show all the way down. So you've got Group A and Group B. You approach things in Group A with a spirit of geometry. You don't worry about how the coal and the iron feel when you put them in a furnace and how the petroleum feels when you refine it. You just take it and use it. Group B, you have the spirit of finesse. You don't treat your wife like you treat the coal, the iron, and the steel. Now, let's combine Pascal and Lewis. For the sake of science, in the practice of science, we act as if the universe is the whole show. When we're dealing with the scientific image, we act as if the universe is the whole show and we can deconstruct everything. That's the approach. That's the spirit of geometry that we approach it with. That's the scientific method. It's non-circular, non-homuncular, as John lays out in his videos on Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. But human beings don't like to be treated like things. They don't like it at all. And again, Jordan makes this point in many of his videos. Treat people this way, you'll get a pretty angry response. I don't care if they really feel like the universe is just one whole show. They are really adamant about being grouped in Group B and not being deconstructed into Group A. They don't like it if you make videos about them doing it. They just don't like it. So, if we approach Group A things with the spirit of geometry, let's approach Group B things with the spirit of finesse. That, in fact, is the appropriate way because people are enormously complex. And the spirit of finesse is actually the better way to approach them. Better for what? Better for all kinds of reasons. We also act as if the universe is not the whole show. I'm excluded from the whole show. My Cell phone stand does not have a meaning crisis. People have a meaning crisis. We aspire to not treat people as objects. We demand that we not be treated as objects. We act as if there is an important category of person, and rightly approach persons with the spirit of finesse. We regard persons as agents within the agent arena relationship. We regard persons as complex and powerful entities because, in fact, they are legion. They are fractalicious. They have subpersonalities way, way down. They have a consciousness Congress. And and you are only hearing from the Speaker of the House, but the rest of the Congress is back there knowing things that they won't tell the Speaker. And so we discover them in our dreams. There's a cause and effect spirit of geometry at play within people that we always map out. Well, I've noticed that when I leer at the young girls, my wife doesn't treat me so well. There's a cause and effect. I notice that when I yell at my neighbor, he keeps letting his dog poop on my lawn. There's a cause and effect. In other words, the spirit of geometry can and should, at times and places, be applied to persons. And it's at work within ourselves and with each other for our betterment. We want patterns. And in fact, people very much want predictability in spouses and neighbors and business partners and all sorts of things. And we receive this if someone comes to you and says, please help me with my sobriety. I'm sorry, you're a person. I can't apply the spirit of geometry to you. Well, maybe if you want help with your sobriety, there's some things down inside you that you have to get straight. So find an AA group and start working on your steps. Because if you work it, it works, right? Now, persons looking at persons. Because we are persons looking at persons, there's often a circularity that complicates the spirit of geometry. And this is often illustrated by Bret Weinstein talking about the assassin robot transcending its programming. Wait a minute. If the assassin robot is transcending its programming, it's just a smarter assassin. That's the hermeneutic of suspicion, right? That's postmodernity. There are no narratives. Abraham Lincoln was a bigot. George Washington was a slave owner. Everyone's corrupt. There's just one thing we're all doing, looking at our own self-interest. Well, we attempt to approximate a monarchical vision, which we think of as objectivity within community. And again, it's a decent practice, but it's always unachievable. We rightly approach persons with the spirit of finesse. The spirit of finesse is the appropriate mode for approaching persons because of their complexity and power. So as a pastor, I might gently suggest that if you want to get sober, here are some steps. So there's some of the spirit of geometry, but there's also the spirit of finesse. I'm not going to stick heads on a pike. I'm going to be careful with a band hammer. Respect for persons is a hard-won, practical, and successful cultural adaptation. Read René Girard. Big consequences for not doing so. And I would assert that anyone practicing Stoicism post-Christendom is seeing it through a Christendom lens. Regard collectives of people as persons. Uncle Sam wants you. Uncle Sam is a principality. And we approach the government with the spirit of finesse. We treat groups of people, minority groups, all kinds of groups of people, with the spirit of finesse. Families, cities, nations, civilization, principalities, and powers. Look at my conversation with Jonathan Peugeot. Historical processes, including the future, are made up of people. This is, again, a sneaky from below argument that Jordan Peterson brings in, and happy to see that his Easter video is back online now on his channel. Because here's the crazy thing about sacrificing for the future. Both the past and the future are so filled with people that we ought to approach them with the spirit of finesse. And we traditionally employ the grammar of persons for these principalities and collective persons. Now, we even afford this below us, non-human living persons. We afford animal rights and limited personalities to our pets. We name our animals. We have companion animals for the lonely. We talk to plants, the autopoietic entities, and the anti-entropic entities. And again, see that edition of Unbelievable with James Tour and Lee Cronin about the origins of life debate. We act as if complex and powerful inorganic entities are persons. Look at the Chernobyl disaster. The best way to approach a nuclear catastrophe such as Chernobyl or the one in Japan not too many years ago is in fact the spirit of finesse. That's why you have the right hemisphere of your brain. That's why you approach it that way. Now, part of you knows, or at least is suspect, that it isn't a person, but that's the most proper mode in approaching it. It's why we name our cars. It's why we name machines, nuclear reactors, immaterial systems and institutions. We rightly approach with the spirit of finesse. Powerful, complex things in nature with the spiritual of finesse. Nature in the ancient world was imagined as persons. She was demythologized and reduced to the spirit of geometry, but mostly in our abstractions. All models are wrong. Some models are helpful. As if they were persons, we approach weather and climate, volcanism, astrophysical events. We approach them with the spirit of finesse, even though we largely suspect the spirit of geometry can be very effective. These systems are too large, powerful, and complex for us to control. So we approach them with the spirit of geometry, as we do respectfully with other persons. In other words, we're always using both. Now, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, Vancouver 1, epiphany moment for me. When at the end of the video, hey Jordan, we haven't nailed Jordan down on the religiosity thing. We need to have a little exorcism here. We've got to get religiosity out of Jordan, even though he doesn't go to church. So that's why Jordan is this liminal in-between figure. Now, God number one and God number two, Jordan says, okay, Jordan, what kind of God do you believe in? He hauls out his Surface book and he starts reading this list. Just thinking, oh, this is a really interesting list, Jordan. And then Sam's like, wait a minute. That's not what people mean by God. And I thought, Sam, you should read some philosophy. You should read some theology. Because, you know what? That's very much what people think of as God. In fact, the Jewish tradition started this. God number one is the system of all systems. God number two is the person of all persons. God number one, the whole earth is full of his glory, immanent. God number two, holy, 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 transcendent. We rightly explore with the spirit of geometry as we do respectfully with other persons. We observe the patterns and we adjust ourselves accordingly to it. Read the book of Numbers. We rightly relate with the spirit of finesse, because as we do with other persons, because we know finally we have to live. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And just like we should have a healthy fear of volcanism and of the weather and of a nuclear power plant and of electricity, you should have a healthy fear of the Lord, because it's far beyond you. God number one, the system of all systems. God number two, the person of all persons. Reality is that which finally controls, colonizes, wins, endures. We often expose our acting worldview by how we use this word. People naturally repersonalize the universe post-Christian. Look at Verizon Lisa. You can look up this video. Verizon Lisa starts talking to the universe. It's a common post-Christian circumlocution. You don't want to say God because that sounds religious, so universe, that doesn't sound religious. I'll be on this political side. Demythologizing the world hasn't made rational hasn't made people rational in the ways the celebrity atheists imagine. Their project is a failure and shows no signs, even with the rise of the nuns, of succeeding. Because the nuns, first they get spiritual. You know what's downhill from spiritual? Religious. Because people love patterns and predictability. So they will get religious. They'll just be religious about stranger and more poorly organized things. See, and I think in a lot of ways, you got the polarity of religious and non-religious, and the IDW is right in the middle. It's right in the middle. They're trying to work on the polarity. And this, again, is why I think Jordan is at the center of this. Because he did it better, and I think that can be testified to the wave that swelled around him. He was right there in the middle between this polarity in the American population. Religiosity is the practice of approaching God as person. The integration of God number one and God number two. Theology and doctrine approach God with a spirit of geometry, especially in the modern era. Science approaches God in this way too. That's how science started. Science started in the deistic period when you could push God a little bit further back and say, we're going to love God by paying careful attention to his patterns. You know how you want to make your spouse happy? Look at their patterns and have their slippers or their coffee or their favorite article, or you have a special date night planned. Here's a gift. What kind of gifts do people want to get from their beloved? You read my mind. What does that mean? You read my patterns. It's the spirit of finesse. I respect them. It's also the spirit of geometry. I'm learning the patterns. And it's a way of loving God with your mind. That's where science was birthed. Science is the love child. It really is. Worship approaches God in the spirit of finesse mode. Fear, repentance, obedience, submission. This, if you're looking at the YouTube, this is a picture of my father. This was the last picture that was taken when he was at a church event before he died. And then my sister, who's an artist, put the art behind him, put the art behind him and put this verse from Acts 20. I consider my life worth nothing to me. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. The fear of the Lord, spirit of finesse, a God of grace, the patterns, spirit of geometry comes together. Now, I want to go back to something I played before. Now, again, I don't think they know it, but this is what they're doing. And again, the Speaker of the House doesn't know everything the rest of the Consciousness Congress knows. But the IDW is here in the middle working on this stuff, the polarization of religiosity, and they want to come into the middle. Now, of course, Jordan, in that sense, was the quintessential member of the IDW because Sam wanted to exercise the spirit of finesse from him in terms of, let's say, the resurrection. And he kind of bullied Jordan that one time, but there's a regression to the mean, as Bret said. Jordan's not going to give up on this stuff, I suspect, especially after what he's been through over the last 9 months. Science has become decadent. When I hopped onto the Portal Discord server, one of the things I was thinking of is that in many ways, the university replaced the church. And the university has become sort of like the medieval Roman Catholic Church. And in some ways, the way the IDW is sort of like Protestant reformers in some ways. They're pointing out the decadence. They don't want it anymore, and they want it to reform. But just sort of like Martin Luther, Bret Weinstein gets kicked out. So Bret is sort of a Martin Luther figure in that sense. Science has become decadent. Religious scientists have managed compartmentalization to include the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry, both hemispheres of the brains working together. The question is, how will that work out in practice?
Here's my gambit as to why they're going to end up back together. The first
They're talking about
problem is that science has become very decadent and very vulnerable because it now has developed this kind of fetishization of incremental steps and doing everything through an institution.
Fetishization of the spirit of geometry.
That is got speed bumps everywhere to make sure that all credit is diffused. Nothing large seems to want to happen.
Get that spirit of finesse out of there. In many ways, when you listen to Eric talk about what he wants for science, he wants the spirit of finesse back in, baby.
And that careful science is in favor and romantic science is out. That creates a huge opportunity for anyone willing to potentially play Russian roulette with their career.
Opportunity because he understands that true science is the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry coming together.
So if you want to swing for the fences, to use another metaphor, a little less gory, maybe you can do something briefly at the beginning of your career if you get lucky. And who's going to take that risk? It's going to be, in general, people who believe in something larger than a career. And the group offenses, to use another metaphor, a little less gory, maybe you can do something briefly at the beginning of your career if you get lucky. And who's going to take that risk? It's going to be, in general, people who believe in something larger than a career.
People who don't believe it's just the whole show. And there's nothing beyond the whole show. That the spirit of geometry isn't finally, fundamentally controlling everything, but the spirit of finesse exists.
And the group that I see that is, I didn't know that they were out there. It was very surprising.
Didn't think that they were out there. That's just religious bigotry because, again, the religious and the non-religious, that's the new polarization.
Is religious scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And religious scientists fall into sort of two main categories. One, that allow their religion to doctor their science, and these people do not, I don't want to get close to them because it just makes for bad science and bad religion. There's another group that says, you know what, I will play by the rules of science, but my religion motivates me and informs me as to what might be possible. So I'm not going to pretend.
What might be possible? Well, that's kind of this understanding, well, maybe my current frame of what is possible is too limited. That's sort of miraculous thinking. But it's the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse integrated.
And the things that are true that aren't true, or the reverse. I am, however, going to take a stab at things that I'm curious about. And if I have to pay for it with my career and my reputation, I am filled with the spirit of trying to honor something greater than myself.
Why? Because, again, similar to that Acts 20 passage that I just read, I consider my life worth nothing to me. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me. Well, what task is that? Well, there's something bigger motivating you.
And myself. Those people are fascinating to me, and I've met a few of them now.
You should have James Tour on your channel. He's an interesting guy. Low in agreeableness, dogged, exactly the kind, and then crazy Christian.
And they're taking big risks with their career, poking around at places where scientific consensus has formed. I mean, this is very particular in biology. So, roughly speaking, my own orientation is that I would say I believe in the theory of selection, and I don't believe in the instantiation of the theory of selection, particularly around random mutation. I believe that what happened is we had such a need to stop the Jesus smugglers, which is my terminology for people trying to bring that in.
Yep.
What does he mean by Jesus smugglers? He means people that they're basically fudging and cheating on their science for their religious motivation. In other words, they're dishonest. And, I read a book by former Tim Stafford, former editor of Christianity Today, and again, the neo-evangelicals, which arose kind of as a middle way response to the modernist fundamentalist fight at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Mary Worthen's book on them is outstanding. So Tim Stafford, former editor of Christianity Today, has a book on science and religion where he starts with creation scientists. And these might be exactly the kinds of scientists that Eric doesn't like. But it's kind of this crazy, if they're fudging, if they're lying, it'll be borne out. It'll be borne out. Give it time. But they're out there thinking very different thoughts on their own. Let them think thoughts. Let them be crazy. But, Christians are along this line. And I would argue that, in fact, what we're going to see in the religion that isn't a religion is that people are going to get increasingly religious. So, and of course, John Vervaeke has all these categories pretty nicely staked out, and it's just interesting to me his and completely understandable, his meditation videos every day during the pandemic crisis, because he's trying to work on the process of belief formation. Now the Jesus smuggling, again, as I understand it here, the Jesus smuggling is basically cheating, and it's dishonest, and absolutely call people on that stuff. But that's different from the biases of excluding them outright. And again, for me, this shows an aspect of the IDW, which I think is right sort of in the tension here, where the spirit of geometry has taken over. It's Ian McGilchrist's complaint about left brain thinking in our culture, and the spirit of finesse needing to open it up and in order to actually address the decadence and find new growth.
At the door, that the idea was, let's just pretend that we actually know what the mechanisms of selection are. And so as a result, we hardened evolutionary theory into a bulwark against Jesus smugglers. And that bulwark is in fact retarding scientific progress.
And that's what happened to the university. The university that was born out of the church, then let's keep grandma away from the kids.
Progress within the field.
But of course, religious people started their own universities. And religious scientists are working the tensions as they go.
Nobody can even have that thought, because it's seen as a great achievement to make sure that no Jesus smugglers have gotten through the bulwark.
Right. There are no gaps for God.
There are no gaps for your God, sir. Right.
Got to keep the woo out, and you're gonna have to risk the woo. You're gonna have to go off into that chaotic territory to get the girl or get the gold or get the truth.
And the idea is that you may have to introduce a gap. Somebody may try to put a God there, and then you may fill in that gap with science later.
And again, if you think about a puzzle, God is the table, and your view is the puzzle, and the God of the gaps, well, that's just because you're seeing through the spirit of geometry at more spirit of finesse, which is frankly infinite, and you're not going to get to the bottom of it. So you're not going to run out of it.
But the idea of potentially having a period of time where there's a God in a gap that is opened up is anathema to a particular generation of evolutionary theorists. As an example, same thing happens in cosmology, where the cosmological impulse to understand, well, where did we come from and what is this place, may be more animated by people who are willing to take a pay cut to study whatever they may view as the Lord's toenail clippings or whatever it is, because it has clues about the nature of reality. Maybe somebody who doesn't believe in God is going to be less animated by that and choose a position at Goldman Sachs.
That's a very optimistic perspective.
I
like it. Obviously, I mean,
well, let's drink to it,
let's
sir.
let's drink to that. I mean, it's interesting. I think about this a lot in medicine, because I've had Lyme disease.
And you have to approach Lyme disease with the spirit of finesse, because the geometry doesn't work. And in rushes the Jesus smugglers and the energy smugglers and the Deepak Chopra smugglers and the herbalist smugglers and the conspiracy theorists. And so again, I know some on Twitter continue to dismiss Eric, but his Megamind Alex Jones cross, there's something right about that. There's something right about that. He's leaving the gaps open because he understands there are gaps there, and he's honest about it. And so I think he's looking for honest people who are willing to, even the name of the portal, again, you're really talking about a sacrament. That's what you're really looking for. And read this book. Might make you think about what we mean by God, and listen to Jordan and think about that God number one. The whole earth is full of his glory. Isn't glory the thing that we're looking for? Not to possess and hoard, because when we possess it and we hoard it, it becomes shrivel and dried out and crusty. But when we share it and give it away, it flourishes and grows and multiplies. So, religious or not religious, we got some biases we need to get beyond. I'm just under 3 hours, 5 more minutes. And I thought back over the recording I just made, and I thought how, in some ways, I didn't cap this argument, because this argument that I made with John Vervaeke essentially boils down to this. How do you approach the world? You approach the world as if it is greater than you. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. God is gracious. That's in many ways the Old and the New Testament together. You, in fact, continue to work the spirit of geometry with the patterns of the world. Science is particularly good at that. But you approach the world with fear in terms of the spirit of finesse, that this isn't something you will wield. This isn't something you wield little parts of it, group A things. This is something that you, in fact, must approach with fear and humility and integrity. And that's where this goes. And the argument is that if you approach the world only with the spirit of geometry, you lose everything, because you're not big enough. You don't know enough. You live too short a time. You never will. So you approach the world with both. Theology and doctrine approach God with the spirit of geometry mode. Science approaches God in this way too. Worship approaches God in the spirit of finesse mode. Fear, respect, obedience, submission, religiosity. That's the point.